They wore crowns, commanded empires, and dined beneath chandeliers. Yet behind palace walls, some were quietly ruled by stranger things, obsessions, compulsions, cravings they never wanted the public to see. From kings who gambled away dignity to queens who mourned for decades, these aren't just royal habits, they're royal fixations. And the deeper you dig, the more it starts to feel less like history, and more like a secret too perfectly managed. This is 25 English royals with strange addictions. They didn't want you to know, where power meets obsession, and the crown hides more than jewels. Before we dive in, if you're into royal secrets, historical rabbit holes, or just weird human behavior dressed in velvet, go ahead and subscribe to the channel. It helps more than you know. And while you're here, drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Midnight in Manchester? 3 a.m. in Toronto? Let's see who else is up deep scrolling through royal dysfunction. 1. Henry VIII. Let's begin with the king who treated England like a very elaborate casino, and somehow still lost. Henry VIII wasn't addicted to war, or wives, or even power. Not really. He was addicted to chance. Dice, cards, bowls, tables, gambling, in its rawest medieval form. And the worst part? He was terrible at it. We know this not because his enemies gossiped about it in pamphlets, but because the man couldn't stop writing it down. The privy purse accounts, essentially the Tudor king's itemized receipts, detail a steady, tragicomic outflow of coins straight into the pockets of whoever sat across the table. And it wasn't pennies either. Hundreds of pounds in Tudor money, the kind of cash that could buy you a castle and a small army of syphilitic footmen, just disappeared into card games and dice rolls, sometimes in a single night. To be clear, gambling wasn't abnormal for a king. It was a staple of aristocratic recreation, as essential to court. Life is hawking or poisoning your relatives with plausible deniability. But even by those standards, Henry's habits raised eyebrows. Not for the games themselves, bowls, backgammon, cards, dice, but for the stakes, and the frequency, and the fact that he kept losing. This is not a man who occasionally placed a wager at Christmas for sport. This is a man who once bet so much money on a single game of dice that his treasurer had to record it twice. It wasn't scandal exactly, it was worse. It was embarrassing. Kings were supposed to win. Henry lost again and again, and then called it recreation. At some point in the 1520s, one of his closest aides tried to soften the optics by describing it as cheerful play. But when cheerful play costs a small fortune weekly, the cheer dims. There's a strange, uncomfortable poetry to this. A king obsessed with control, unable to control the most basic itch in his psyche, the thrill of the unknown. Henry, the ruler who reshaped the English church to fit his libido, couldn't reshape a deck of cards. He ruled over the fates of thousands, but dice ruled him. And yet it never became a full-blown scandal. Why? Because no one wanted to say the quiet part out loud, that the most powerful man in England had the same behavioral patterns as a broke tavern addict in Southwark. Gambling was part of royal masculinity, but only if it looked noble. Henry's problem wasn't the behavior itself, it was the pattern. There's something very modern about this, actually. Compulsions disguised as hobbies, image management over intervention, and when the losing got too obvious to ignore, the language simply shifted. What once was wasteful became festive. What was reckless became jovial. The Tudor court didn't hide Henry's gambling. They rebranded it. But why did he gamble? The obvious answer, boredom, doesn't hold up. Henry VIII was not bored. He was busy rewriting the laws of heaven, dissolving monasteries and inventing Protestant England out of sheer marital inconvenience. No, Henry wasn't killing time. He was feeding a need, the need to push, to test, to press against invisible lines, with wives, with religion, with cards. It's no coincidence that he loved tournaments too, not for the spectacle, but for the risk. We'll come back to that later. The question isn't just why he gambled. It's why he needed to lose. This is where it gets uncomfortable. The court didn't care that the king gambled. They cared that the king looked weak. A monarch who loses at war is a tragic figure. A monarch who loses at dice is a punchline. But it's hard to manage an addiction when the addict writes his own PR. The privy purse was never meant to be public. These records were inward-facing. Which means Henry wasn't hiding it. He was justifying it. He saw no problem. But his advisors did. They began normalizing it in court culture. The king is in good humor, they'd say, when the losses stacked up. The king is at play. Nobody wanted to accuse the monarch of having a compulsion, so they reframed it as a virtue, generous in victory, gracious in defeat. Never mind that the defeats kept coming. Never mind that the sums grew larger. Never mind that this recreational play bled into moments of real political urgency. What happens when a king is more invested in the dice than the diplomacy? You get a church split for personal reasons. You get wives cycled through like court positions. You get distractions upon distractions. You get a king who would rather bet against fate than manage it. And still, it's mostly forgotten, because history likes its villains neat and clean. Henry VIII, tyrant. Henry VIII, executioner. Henry VIII, serial husband. These are clean lines, easy packaging. But Henry VIII, man with a compulsive gambling problem? That's messy. That's not iconic. That's just sad. And so we don't talk about it. But the receipts are there, literally. In one entry, he loses over $300 in a single evening. In today's money, that's uncomfortable. And then he goes to Mass the next morning like nothing happened. King of England, servant of God, chronic loser at dice. Even the language in the records is sly. You'll find lines like, "To the Lord Henry for play at dice, lost to him by the king's grace, $80. You can almost hear the scribe sighing as he writes it. Another night, another loss. Another notch on the ledger of royal weakness. Of course, none of this destroyed his reputation in the long run. Henry VIII's image was too big, too bloody, too foundational. But look a little closer, and the cracks are there. A king addicted to risk, desperate for control, bleeding money into a void of random outcomes. And in that pattern, that quietly desperate repetition, we see something more than vice. We see a man who mistook luck for power, who thought he could beat the odds because he had beaten Parliament, who believed that if he just kept throwing the dice, eventually the universe would give him what he wanted, a son, a victory, a moment of control over something he couldn't name. He never got it, but he kept trying. Which brings us, neatly, to another royal whose appetite for excess made Henry look almost restrained. A man who not only gambled, but drank his way through a kingdom, and then tried to medicate the hangover out of existence. Let's talk about George IV. 2. George IV. George IV was a man made of velvet, vanity, and very bad decisions. If Henry VIII was addicted to risk, George was addicted to recovery. Or rather, to whatever numbed the consequence of having lived too much and felt too little. Before he even made it to the throne, while still only the Prince of Wales, George had already racked up a resume of excess that would make a Roman emperor blush. His drug of choice wasn't just one thing. It was everything that made him feel royal without the effort of actually being it. Drink, laudanum, fancy clothes, narcissistic architecture, and more drink. But the core of it all, the main thread running through his existence, was a chemical dependency dressed up as a lifestyle. He wasn't addicted to celebration. He was addicted to sedation. Let's start with the bottle. George was a professional drinker, but not in the convivial, pub-lurking way you might associate with the working-class image of 18th century England. No. George drank lavishly, theatrically, and deliberately. His evenings were calendar-worthy events of consumption. It's not that he drank to celebrate. It's that drinking was the celebration, and the point was to disappear into the bottom of a brandy bottle, into a world where his debts didn't exist, where Parliament wasn't knocking, and where his own body hadn't already begun to collapse under the weight of his habits. He drank because he could. He drank because it dulled the unbearable noise of being expected to rule. He drank because the applause of sycophants sounded better through a haze. And then there was the laudanum. By the time George became king in 1820, a mere 10 years before his death, his body was already a cocktail of regrets. Years of indulgent living had ravaged his health, and the solution presented to him, as it was to many suffering nobles of the time, was opium. Of course, they didn't call it addiction. They called it medication. Laudanum, a tincture of opium mixed with alcohol, was standard issue for everything from headaches to heartbreak. In George's case, it became part of the daily routine. Sources describe vast quantities of the drug being consumed in his later years. Vast is a polite word. It means nobody wanted to count. It means the numbers were embarrassing or worse, dangerous. By the 1820s, George IV was essentially being medically managed into consciousness. The opiates weren't just dulling his pain, they were performing a pantomime of functionality. The king would appear in public, doped and powdered, plump and glazed, and then vanish again into the curtained privacy of Carlton House or Windsor. A monarch on pause, a figurehead sedated for the sake of continuity. Why wasn't this a public scandal? Because the monarchy has always been better at preserving images than healing individuals. A sick king was a constitutional threat. A sedated king, on the other hand, that was manageable. As long as he could wave and sign things, the illusion could hold. And the British monarchy is built on illusion more than anything else. George had spent his entire life grooming that illusion. He had been raised not just to rule, but to perform ruling. Even as a young prince, he showed an instinctive flair for the performative. He was obsessed with clothing, with ceremony, with being looked at. As king, this instinct hardened into pathology. He didn't want to be powerful. He wanted to look powerful, effortlessly so. But power, it turned out, was exhausting. So he drank. And when the drink stopped working, he turned to something stronger. Laudanum became the silence between the noise. It was the pause button on a life of theatrical excess. But the cost was staggering. George IV's reign was marked by withdrawal in every sense, not just from politics, which he delegated whenever possible, but from reality itself. His public appearances were rare, often propped up by aides and chemists, while his private life became a slow, molasses-thick spiral into physical decay. His weight ballooned, his speech slurred, his gait slowed, his cognition, while still present, became sluggish, distracted, and always, the bottle and the vial, close at hand. The irony here is brutal. This was a man who wanted to be remembered as the ultimate embodiment of refinement. He commissioned extravagant palaces, collected art like it was oxygen, designed Brighton Pavilion to look like an opium dream in architecture form, all in pursuit of a reputation, aesthetic genius, taste, majesty. And yet, behind the silk curtains, the taste was bitter. Laudanum, the desperate taste of a man trying not to feel. Historians often struggle with how to frame George IV. On paper, he was not a bad king. He supported the arts. He pushed for Catholic emancipation. He helped shape the Regency style that defined an entire cultural moment. But all of it feels like distraction. What do you do with a man whose greatest skill was pretending to be someone else? His addiction wasn't just to opiates, it was to avoidance. George didn't want to rule. He wanted to float. There's something heartbreakingly modern in that. A life curated like a feed. A public image drenched in filters. The silent collapse of a person behind the spectacle. It's easy to mock him. And many did, in cartoons and satire and pamphlets. But mocking misses the point. George IV wasn't just excessive. He was emptying himself faster than he could fill the role he'd inherited. And the drugs didn't help. They just slowed the fall. Even his final years felt like a long goodbye. By 1829, he was barely functional. The sedation had become the baseline. There are reports of days passing without him leaving bed. Letters went unanswered, decisions delayed, and yet publicly the facade remained. The royal standard flew. The newspapers printed the usual formalities. No mention of the bottles, no whisper of the vials. We don't talk about George IV's laudanum habit much anymore. It doesn't fit the narrative. It clashes with the wallpaper of Regency nostalgia, the fancy gowns, the balls, the Jane Austen aesthetics. But behind all of that was a man slowly medicating himself out of relevance, and the monarchy let him, because the system prefers sedation to scandal. Of course, this wasn't the only vice that George couldn't resist. His relationship with luxury, with gold-threaded clothing, mirrored rooms, champagne breakfasts, deserves a section of its own. But we'll come to that. For now, what matters is the image. A king slouched in velvet, pupils pinpricked, raising a glass to no one in particular. A man who spent more time in retreat than in rule. What does it say about a monarchy when the only way a king can function is by chemically disabling himself? It says the system isn't built to save individuals. It's built to preserve images. George IV became a moving portrait, the living embodiment of ceremonial nothingness. But his addictions didn't die with him. They echoed, faintly, then more loudly, in the behaviors of his descendants. Because royal compulsions don't just vanish, they get repackaged, reframed, sometimes as hobbies, sometimes as quirks, sometimes as scandals in disguise. And that brings us, inevitably, to a man who took that aristocratic addiction to gambling and turned it into actual scandal. A man who didn't just lose money at cards, he lost dignity in court. Literally. Let's talk about Edward VII. And if you're still with us after 2 royals and several centuries of strange behavior, you belong here. Go ahead and subscribe if you haven't already. This rabbit hole only gets deeper. While you're at it, tell us in the comments. Where are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Are you doom scrolling at 2 a.m. or casually judging monarchs over lunch? We see you. 3. Albert Edward, Prince of Wales, later Edward VII. Edward didn't just gamble. He insisted on gambling, even when everyone around him was quietly begging him to stop. By the time Albert Edward, Prince of Wales, entered adulthood, gambling wasn't merely a pastime. It was a declaration of identity. It was how he proved he was not his mother. It was how he reassured himself that he belonged to the elite male world of risk, bravado, and whispered deals conducted behind heavy curtains. And it was how he repeatedly placed the future of the monarchy in situations that absolutely did not need a deck of cards involved. Edward, later Edward VII, was raised under the suffocating shadow of Queen Victoria, a woman whose sense of duty bordered on religious obsession. She disapproved of excess. She disapproved of pleasure. And most of all, she disapproved of Edward. To her, he was undisciplined, unserious, and dangerously fond of indulgence. And nothing embodied that fear more clearly than his love for gambling. This wasn't small-stakes amusement. Edward gambled in elite houses, with aristocrats, military officers, and members of high society who understood one rule above all others: discretion. Gambling was acceptable as long as it remained invisible. The moment it became public, it stopped being sport and became scandal. And Edward, with a kind of reckless optimism that bordered on self-sabotage, kept nudging it toward the light. The most infamous example was the Tranby Croft affair, a baccarat game in 1890 that detonated into public humiliation. Baccarat itself wasn't unusual. The problem was that it was illegal for money. Everyone involved knew this. Everyone assumed that, as usual, nothing would come of it. Gentlemen would lose, gentlemen would win, and no one would ever speak of it again. But something went wrong. A disagreement broke out over cheating. Accusations flew. Pride got involved. And suddenly, the matter didn't stay in drawing rooms. It ended up in a courtroom. And the heir to the British throne was summoned as a witness. This is the point where the entire system briefly froze in terror. Because Edward didn't just gamble. He gambled publicly, and now the law was asking him questions about it. He was placed in the absurd position of having to testify about an illegal card game while maintaining the dignity of the future king. Newspapers pounced. Cartoonists sharpened their pencils. Moralists salivated. The damage wasn't just personal, it was constitutional. The British monarchy survives on the illusion that its private behavior is morally superior, or at least morally irrelevant. Edward shattered that illusion by doing something unforgivable. He dragged his vice into the legal system. The court case exposed the informal code of aristocratic secrecy that protected elite indulgence. Suddenly, everyone could see how casually the upper classes ignored laws meant for everyone else. Edward wasn't charged, he wasn't punished, but he was exposed. And for a royal heir, exposure is worse than guilt. Behind the scenes, the palace went into full containment mode. The narrative had to be managed carefully. Edward was portrayed as an unfortunate bystander, caught in a misunderstanding, an innocent gentleman merely present at an event that spiraled out of control. What wasn't emphasized was the pattern. The frequency with which Edward gambled, the eagerness with which he sought these environments, and the degree to which he relied on them as emotional fuel. Because that's what gambling was for Edward, fuel. Edward craved approval. He wanted laughter, warmth, indulgence, everything his upbringing denied him. Gambling rooms offered instant validation. Wins brought applause. Losses brought sympathy. Either way, he was seen. And for a man raised by a mother who treated affection like a scarce resource, that mattered more than money. But there's another layer here, and it's less flattering. Edward also believed, deeply, that his status placed him above consequence. The rules were for others. Gambling laws were technicalities. Courtrooms were abstractions. This wasn't arrogance so much as assumption. The assumption that the system would bend around him, because it always had. The Tranby Croft affair shattered that assumption just enough to sting. Public reaction was harsh. Editorials questioned his judgment. Moralists asked whether a man so fond of cards and late nights could be trusted with the empire. Queen Victoria was furious. She saw the incident not as a lapse, but as proof that her son was fundamentally unfit, impulsive, pleasure-driven, and incapable of restraint. And yet, nothing changed. Edward didn't stop gambling. He became more careful. He moved games to safer houses. He relied on tighter circles. The addiction adapted. The behavior didn't disappear. It just learned camouflage. This is the part history often glosses over. Edward VII is remembered as genial, sociable, charming. A king who brought warmth back to the monarchy after Victoria's long mourning. And that's true. But it's also true that his reign carried the quiet residue of decades spent prioritizing indulgence over discipline. Gambling wasn't an isolated flaw. It was part of a broader pattern of excess. Food, drink, leisure, all treated as entitlements rather than risks. The monarchy learned something crucial from Edward's scandal. Never let vice reach the courts again. Future royal indulgences would be managed with tighter secrecy, stronger public relations, and when necessary, medical euphemism. Edward's embarrassment became a lesson in containment. The problem wasn't that he gambled. It was that the gambling became visible. And visibility is poison to inherited power. There's a quiet tragedy in all this. Edward didn't gamble because he was reckless. He gambled because it made him feel momentarily free. Free from expectation, from maternal judgment, from the crushing weight of destiny. At the table, he was just another man chasing luck. Unfortunately, he was also the future king, and the country watched every throw of the dice. By the time he finally ascended the throne in 1901, the gambling scandals had faded, replaced by the softer glow of an older, indulgent monarch. But the habit never truly left him. It simply blended into a broader culture of excess that would, over time, take a visible toll on his health. And in that way, Edward left behind more than stories of baccarat and courtroom awkwardness. He left behind a model, a royal template in which indulgence was tolerated as long as it stayed out of sight, and health consequences were treated as unfortunate footnotes. That template would echo loudly in the next generation. Because Edward wasn't the last royal to gamble with his body, his habits, and his public image. He just happened to be the one who taught the palace how dangerous visibility could be. And soon visibility would take a very different form, not in courtrooms or card rooms, but in ashtrays, cocktail glasses, and a princess whose habits were far harder to rebrand as harmless charm. Princess Margaret is waiting. 4. Princess Margaret, Countess of Snowdon. Princess Margaret didn't gamble with cards or dice. She gambled with her own lungs, her liver, and her carefully curated image, slowly, publicly, and with a cigarette permanently between her fingers. If the British monarchy had a rebel icon in the mid-20th century, it was Margaret. She was glamorous where others were dutiful, sharp-tongued where others were restrained, and visibly indulgent in a family that preferred its excesses either ceremonial or invisible. And her addictions, because that's what they were, even if the word was never used, sat right at the intersection of indulgence and image control. From a young age, Margaret smoked. Not casually, not socially, routinely, relentlessly. Biographers and journalists describe her consuming cigarettes at a rate that would have startled even hardened journalists of the era. Chain smoking wasn't a quirk. It was the rhythm of her day. Conversations punctuated by ash taps. Long evenings fueled by smoke and spirits. The cigarette wasn't an accessory. It was a constant. And then there was the drinking. Like many royals of her generation, Margaret drank heavily. But unlike most, she did it openly. Whiskey was her preferred companion, often beginning in the late morning and stretching into the small hours of the night. Staff noticed. Friends joked. Journalists hinted. And the palace once again worked overtime to translate dependence into glamour. That translation is important. Margaret lived at a moment when smoking and drinking still carried cultural prestige, especially among elites. Cigarettes were sophistication. Whiskey was confidence. Excess was forgiven if it sparkled. And Margaret sparkled. She had the sharp laugh, the cutting wit, the effortless style. She was photographed constantly, often with a cigarette raised like punctuation. The image stuck. The damage was quietly ignored. But image management has limits. Margaret wasn't just a princess with bad habits. She was a woman shaped by frustration, denial, and a lifetime of emotional containment. She grew up during war, lived in the shadow of a sister destined to be queen, and watched as her own desires were subordinated to duty again and again. Her most famous heartbreak, the relationship she was effectively forbidden from pursuing, left a lasting mark. And when the monarchy denied her agency, it didn't offer her coping tools. So she found her own. Smoking and drinking were socially acceptable anesthetics. They offered relief without rebellion, or so it seemed. No one could accuse a princess of impropriety for holding a cigarette. No one could challenge a royal cocktail hour. The habits were normalized, even encouraged, as part of elite social life, until the costs became unavoidable. By the 1970s and 1980s, Margaret's health began to decline in ways that could no longer be framed as unfortunate coincidence. Repeated illnesses, hospitalizations, long recoveries. Still, the palace maintained discretion. Medical bulletins were vague, causes were generalized. The narrative remained one of fragility, not consequence. But behind the scenes, doctors knew, staff knew, friends knew. The body was responding to decades of strain. What makes Margaret's story particularly uncomfortable is that her habits were never truly hidden. They were aestheticized. Photographers captured her mid-smoke. Writers praised her bohemian spirit. Fashion magazines turned her defiance into mood boards. Addiction, when wrapped in couture, became charisma. And yet, charisma doesn't protect organs. Margaret's later years were marked by increasing isolation, physical limitation, and frustration. The very behaviors that once symbolized freedom became constraints. The cigarette that once framed her face now framed her decline. The drinks that once fueled laughter now complicated recovery. There is a quiet cruelty in how the monarchy handled this. Rather than addressing the habits as what they were, coping mechanisms turned compulsions, they were absorbed into the mythology of Princess Margaret the Rebel. A character, a cautionary tale with the edges softened. The system didn't intervene because intervention would have required acknowledgement. And acknowledgement would have cracked the illusion that royal life was merely pressured, not psychologically corrosive. Margaret paid the price for that silence. Her story also exposes a gendered hypocrisy. Male royals drank heavily, smoked constantly, indulged openly, and were framed as hardy, masculine, or unfortunate victims of era-specific norms. Margaret, by contrast, was labeled difficult, temperamental, self-indulgent. The same behaviors read as weakness when performed by a woman, and yet, she never apologized for them. There's something defiant in that. Tragic, but defiant. Margaret understood, perhaps better than most, that the monarchy demanded emotional restraint without offering emotional support. Her addictions were not accidents. They were responses, flawed, damaging responses, to a life lived under permanent observation with limited autonomy. In another family, in another life, she might have been told to slow down, to get help, to step away from the habits that were hollowing her out. In the royal family, she was told, implicitly, to keep smiling, keep smoking, keep being interesting. Because interesting is easier to manage than honest. By the time the public conversation around smoking and health began to shift decisively, it was already too late for Margaret. The damage was cumulative. The narrative had been set. She became a symbol of a fading era, glamour tarnished by excess, rather than a person whose needs had been quietly ignored. And here's the unsettling part. The monarchy learned from this too, not to discourage the habits, but to better control the image. Margaret's openness became a lesson in what not to allow. Later generations would be cleaner, quieter, more polished. Their vices, if they existed, would be obscured behind wellness narratives, hobbies, and carefully curated routines. Smoke would be replaced by silence, because Princess Margaret showed what happens when indulgence is visible. And the institution decided it preferred invisibility. Which brings us to a king whose addiction was far quieter, far tidier, and far more socially acceptable. A man who found his sense of control not in cigarettes or drink, but in tiny rectangles of paper arranged with obsessive precision. George V didn't smoke rebellion. He collected order, and he collected it one stamp at a time. 5. George V. George V didn't gamble. He didn't drink himself into irrelevance. He didn't scandalize courts with baccarat or sabotage his lungs with the flair of his more glamorous relatives. No, his addiction was quieter, cleaner, almost charming. It came in little glassine envelopes, arranged meticulously in leather-bound albums. To the outside world, it looked like a hobby. To George, it was a daily ritual, a need, a compulsion. George V was addicted to stamp collecting. Yes, stamps, postage, tiny squares of printed power. What began as a royal pastime ballooned into an obsession so all-consuming that even palace insiders began whispering about it, not with horror, but with bemused caution. The man was serious, deadly serious. He wasn't just the king of the United Kingdom, he was the king of Philately, and he ruled that paper realm with absolute authority. The story often gets told as a royal footnote. George V collected stamps. The way someone might say, he liked horses, or He enjoyed birdwatching. But those descriptions missed the scale and the tone of what this actually meant. George didn't merely collect. He curated. He cataloged. He structured his emotional life around the procurement, preservation, and perfect placement of stamps. During World War I, when Britain teetered on the edge of social collapse and mass mourning swept the nation, the king could still be found at his desk, poring over rare issues, comparing ink variations, and slipping new acquisitions into protective sleeves with gloved precision. This was not escapism. This was ritualistic control. The obsession had roots. As a naval officer and younger son, George wasn't raised to rule. His older brother was the heir, and George was expected to serve, salute, and vanish into the respectable shadow of someone else's destiny. But fate, as it often does with monarchies, intervened. His elder brother died. Suddenly, the quiet, methodical sailor was next in line. And when he became king, that sense of displacement never fully left him. Stamp collecting offered something kingship couldn't: predictability. Unlike people, stamps didn't lie. They didn't betray, misquote, or rebel. They followed order. They obeyed chronology. They responded to care. They had fixed edges, precise values, and their worth could be measured. You didn't have to wonder what a stamp thought of you. You just had to know where it fit in the album. And George always knew. His collection became not just a hobby, but a parallel monarchy, a kingdom of perforated order, immune to the chaos of war, politics, or family dysfunction. He oversaw it like a sovereign, with rules and preferences and rankings. He kept detailed records. He wrote notes in his own hand. He would cancel state matters to attend philatelic auctions. This wasn't leisure. This was maintenance. The kind that soothes a mind stretched thin by ceremonial expectations and constitutional irrelevance. The Royal Philatelic Collection, as it became known, was more than just a drawer of curiosities. It grew to encompass tens of thousands of items, meticulously sorted, annotated, and preserved. Some stamps were worth entire estates. Others were valuable only to him. It didn't matter. Each had its place. The king would famously spend hours inspecting layouts, rechecking placements, discussing new acquisitions with his curator. He once told a guest, "I wish to God I had been a clerk in a stamp office rather than a king." He meant it. And yet no one called it addiction. How could they? The word didn't fit the image. Addiction was for opium dens and gin alleys, not for a king with a magnifying glass and a steady hand. George's fixation was reframed as charming eccentricity, a genteel oddity, an aristocratic pastime with just enough gravitas to escape ridicule. But those close to him knew better. His fixation with stamps was more than just habit. It was structure. When emotions threatened, he turned to stamps. When family conflict boiled over, he turned to stamps. When the world burned, when empires fell, when monarchies collapsed across Europe, he sat at his desk, flipping through sheets of tiny portraits, looking for missing specimens, breathing evenly. This wasn't escape. It was survival. George wasn't a warm man. He was famously stiff, formal, sometimes abrupt. His children feared him. His court respected him without affection. But with stamps, he was tender. He handled them like fragile truths. He protected them from sunlight, air, moisture. He understood their value more intimately than he understood most of his children. And perhaps that's the point. George V's obsession with stamps wasn't just a quirk. It was a coping mechanism in a family that discouraged emotional transparency. Where others self-medicated with liquor or applause, George chose order. He buried himself in a kingdom where nothing changed without his permission, where history could be held in the palm of his hand. Biographers often debate whether his collecting qualifies as addiction. But that's only because the addiction doesn't look dangerous. It looks tidy, elegant, safe. But compulsions aren't always messy. Sometimes they're clinically clean. George's emotional life narrowed around his stamps. His joy came from successful acquisitions. His anxieties quieted only when he returned to his albums. The attention he gave to his collection sometimes eclipsed the attention he gave to those around him. He could spend 3 hours sorting Victorian penny reds and 15 minutes speaking to a minister. What does it mean when a monarch finds more peace in a stamp than in a child? It means something is broken, quietly, respectably. But broken all the same. The palace, of course, embraced the narrative. It was easy, harmless. They nicknamed him the Collector King. Newspapers wrote flattering profiles about his philatelic expertise. Exhibitions were arranged. Items were lent. No one asked whether the collecting was compulsive, because the behavior fit the brand. Restrained, disciplined, intellectually engaged. The perfect post-Victorian model of a monarch who didn't drink too much, didn't party too loud, didn't stray too far from moral expectations. And yet, behind the scenes, it was all-consuming. The paradox is stark. George's obsession with control emerged from a role where he had almost none. As a constitutional monarch, he reigned but did not rule. He performed tradition, mediated ceremony, and symbolized stability, but made few actual decisions. Stamps, ironically, gave him more direct power than his own government. He could shape his albums. He could determine the sequence, the color scheme, the value hierarchy. It was a world where no parliament could interfere. And so, like many in constrained positions, he built a kingdom small enough to control. What remains unsettling is how easily we dismiss this as charming. We forget that obsession, when socially accepted, becomes invisible. If George had spent the same hours poring over gambling ledgers or whiskey bottles, we'd call it a vice. But stamps? That's refined. That's civilized. But addiction wears many masks, and this one wore a crown. Today, the Royal Philatelic Collection remains one of the most valuable in the world, a monument not just to British postal history, but to a king's quiet desperation to impose order on a world that refused to stay still. And if George V was the king of control, then the next royal in our story flipped that narrative entirely. Because while George found peace in objects, Queen Mary, his wife, found herself compelled to possess them. And once she wanted something, well, very little stood in her way. 6. Queen Mary, Mary of Teck, Queen Consort. Queen Mary didn't fidget. She didn't pace. She didn't raise her voice, and she certainly didn't lose her temper. Not in public, and not in front of the staff. Her compulsion wasn't loud. It was polite. It was regal. It wore gloves and a tiara, and it entered a drawing room, looked over the silverware, and quietly asked if the butler might kindly return the royal teacup that had been passed down by mistake through generations of someone else's family. Queen Mary was, in polite terms, a compulsive collector. In less polite terms, though still whispered behind fans and behind her back, she was something of a kleptomaniac. And if she wasn't, she certainly behaved like one with royal immunity. Her obsession with collecting royal-related objects was more than a hobby. It was a deeply ingrained behavioral pattern, one that shaped not only how she lived, but how she moved through the world. Everywhere she went, she looked for things that belonged in the royal collection. Not in a casual antiquing way, in a focused, borderline unsettling way. She wanted things, and she acquired them through charm, pressure, implication, or sometimes silence. She did not steal. That word was never used. What she did was far more difficult to define. She expected with quiet certainty that anything with a royal story, no matter how vague or sentimental, ought to return to the royal family. And when Queen Mary expected something, it became nearly impossible to refuse her without feeling like a traitor to the crown. It often worked like this. She'd arrive at a stately home, perhaps for tea, perhaps to view a local museum. She'd be shown around by a nervous host. Then her eyes would linger on an object, a snuff box, a portrait miniature, a silver spoon with royal arms, and her voice would drop into a careful, unmistakably suggestive line. "Oh, how charming. I do believe this once belonged to my grandmother." Or worse, "I remember this from Windsor. How very odd that it's here." And with that, the game was over. The host, paralyzed between patriotism and panic, would stammer something about family inheritance, try to backpedal, perhaps mention their great-aunt's will, and then Queen Mary would offer a single, serene smile that implied the matter had already been settled. The object would be packed up before the tea cooled. No payment, no receipts, no legal claim, just the subtle gravity of monarchy pulling the item back into orbit. These weren't isolated stories. They were a pattern, widely recorded by contemporaries, biographers, and historians alike. Some defended her as a preservationist, a living custodian of the royal legacy. Others described her in more psychological terms, a woman who could not stop acquiring, who felt a deep, compulsive need to fill her surroundings with reminders of her dynasty's permanence. It was, they said, emotional architecture, and it made sense. Queen Mary lived through upheaval after upheaval. She had married into the monarchy almost by accident, originally engaged to George V's older brother, who died unexpectedly. She transitioned from grieving fiancée to future queen with alarming efficiency. She watched empires collapse, relatives executed, the social fabric of Britain torn and rewoven during 2 world wars. Control was rare, continuity was fragile. Objects, however, endured, and so she built fortresses from them. Porcelain, furniture, jewelry, letters, paintings, clocks, teacups, frames, cabinets. She knew where everything was supposed to go, because in her mind, the story of the monarchy was told not just through crowns, but through teaspoons and footstools and inkwells. She once reportedly sent a note to a noble family, politely requesting the return of a table the royals had given them 3 generations prior as a wedding gift. There was no legal basis. But there was an emotional one. The object had royal origins, and thus, by Mary's internal logic, it was on loan. Its destiny was not private enjoyment, but public continuity. And people gave in, again and again. Was it addiction? That's the uncomfortable part. Because like George V's stamp obsession, Queen Mary's collecting was framed as a noble pursuit, curiosity, stewardship, an act of historical guardianship. And it was all of those things, until it wasn't, until it blurred the lines between acquisition and fixation, until it became impossible to say whether she loved the objects themselves or the sense of permanence and identity they offered. She wasn't greedy in the traditional sense. She didn't hoard for pleasure. She didn't sell. She didn't scatter. She arranged, labeled, cataloged, docketed. Her private notebooks were dense with entries: object, origin, current location, desired outcome. She chased lost treasures with the intensity of a monarch chasing territory. And the palace didn't stop her. Because Queen Mary's obsession served a purpose. In an age where the monarchy was under pressure to modernize, explain itself, and justify its continued existence, she offered an alternative strategy. Root it deeper in the past. Populate the palaces with memory. Make heritage visible. Make it tactile. Make it speak through tea sets and heirlooms. In doing so, she turned the monarchy into a museum. But even museums have curators. What happens when the curator is compulsive? There's a dark irony here. Queen Mary believed she was preserving the monarchy's story. But in her compulsions, she may have revealed something far more fragile. That the monarchy needed preservation in the first place. That it couldn't rest on divine right or public love alone. That it needed things, artifacts, stuff, not just to function, but to feel real. And Mary made it her mission to ensure that the crown would never look threadbare. She outlived her husband. She watched her sons rise and, in Edward VIII's case, fall. She advised, managed, and carefully maintained an entire symbolic universe, all while quietly acquiring. One day, during a visit to a home of some minor nobility, she admired a small snuff box on a side table. The lady of the house smiled nervously. She said it had belonged to her grandfather. Mary's reply? "I believe it was once mine." The box was surrendered before sunset. She never raised her voice. She never argued. She simply believed that if something had once belonged to the monarchy, it always belonged to the monarchy. Her logic was circular, her conviction unshakable, and her collecting, though never labeled as such, was compulsion made dignified. Even today, much of what fills Britain's royal residences owes its presence not to heritage, but to Mary's relentless pursuit of it. She didn't build a collection. She retrieved one, piece by piece, from the hands of those too polite to say no. And as the monarchy modernized, it quietly backed away from that legacy. No future royal would be allowed to collect so personally, so obsessively, or so controversially. The line had been drawn, again, not by morality, but by visibility. Mary had made her habits too well known. The rumors lingered. But before there were whispers about her collecting, there were whispers about her husbands. Because George V may have filled albums, but Queen Mary filled rooms. And that tension between public role and private compulsion? It didn't die with the couple, it only changed forms. As the monarchy stumbled into the 17th century, another royal, more dramatic, more doomed, found his own escape in paintings, not to collect them, but to consume them as political identity, obsessively, and his name was Charles I. Charles I. Charles V didn't build a collection. He built a worldview, on canvas, in oil, in brushstrokes so fine they seemed to whisper royal authority directly into the walls. He wasn't a hoarder. He was a curator of divinity. His obsession with art wasn't merely aesthetic. It was theological, political, and deeply compulsive. And when he looked at a painting, he didn't just see beauty. He saw himself, reflected not as a flawed man governing a divided kingdom, but as a chosen ruler whose authority was ordained by brush and heaven alike. In simpler terms, Charles V was addicted to art, not in the casual museum day way, but in the way that shapes how a person perceives reality. He didn't just love art, he needed it. Charles lived in a time when monarchy was teetering between sacred right and political burden. The Tudor legacy had left a kingdom more centralized but far more suspicious of divine absolutism. The English Reformation had ripped apart the old sacred order. The monarch no longer had Rome's halo, and the people, particularly the Parliament, were starting to ask dangerous questions about where exactly the crown got its authority from. Charles's answer? Visual dominance. If people wouldn't believe in divine right by scripture or statute, perhaps they would believe it by image. And so he commissioned, acquired, imported, and arranged some of the most powerful, psychologically loaded artwork ever amassed in Britain. Not because he wanted to be surrounded by pretty things, but because he wanted to be surrounded by proof. Proof that kingship was sacred. Proof that he was more than a politician. Proof that monarchy itself wasn't merely useful, it was necessary. He began collecting before he even took the throne. Italian masters, Flemish altarpieces, mythological allegories. Religious iconography reframed to center royal authority. By the time of his coronation in 1625, Charles was already operating as a one-man cultural ministry, aggressively curating a visual kingdom within his physical one. And then came Anthony van Dyck. Van Dyck didn't just paint Charles, he crafted him. With his brush, the king became taller, slimmer, more ethereal. Van Dyck's portraits of Charles are almost dreamlike. Cool lighting, elongated poses, regal serenity. They didn't just reflect the man, they created the myth. And Charles believed the myth. That was the real danger, because in a time of rising social unrest, collapsing finances, and religious division, Charles doubled down, not on reform or diplomacy, but on aesthetics. His court became a temple of art, music, and high ritual. Politics became theater, and the scenery was purchased with crown revenue. The sheer scale of Charles's collecting was unprecedented in England. Between 1625 and 1640, he amassed over 1,500 paintings, tapestries, sculptures, and other artworks, many bought in bulk from cash-strapped European dynasties. He spent enormous sums acquiring masterpieces. He hired agents across the continent to scout for pieces worthy of his divine image, and still, it wasn't enough. He wanted more than representation. He wanted presence. He wanted to feel himself as history in the making. Every corridor in Whitehall, every gallery in his private palaces, was lined with carefully chosen emblems of monarchy's eternal truth. But here's the uncomfortable part. The people paying for it were increasingly angry. The more Charles spent on art, the more he had to raise money. And since Parliament wouldn't fund his extravagance without oversight, Charles did what all good absolutists do when they don't get their way. He shut them out. For 11 years, what became known as the personal rule, Charles governed without Parliament. He raised revenue through forced loans, customs duties, and unpopular fines. The money flowed in, and a good portion of it flowed straight into auctions, shipping crates, and gilded frames. To him, it made perfect sense. These weren't purchases. They were investments in legacy, in symbolism, in sacred order. But to his subjects, it looked a lot like vanity, or worse, distraction. Here was a king who couldn't fund a navy, who alienated his Scottish subjects, who pushed the country toward religious conflict, and yet could always find coin for another Titian. And this is where Charles's obsession crosses from personal compulsion into historical tragedy. Because his collecting wasn't neutral, it became a trigger. Art wasn't just a mirror for Charles, it was a shield, a way of pretending that all was still under control, that monarchy remained unassailable. And the more the country fractured around him, the more he retreated into this curated visual kingdom. He didn't negotiate, he framed. He didn't listen, he rearranged. It's almost poetic, then, that when civil war finally broke out in 1642, Charles left behind not just a broken kingdom, but a magnificent collection of royal illusions. Paintings that showed him in idealized perfection. Portraits that suggested divine serenity. None of them depicted him surrounded by parliamentary soldiers or being marched to the scaffold, but that was coming. When Charles was executed in 1649, his head severed not just from his body but from the myth of divine kingship, it wasn't just a political reckoning, it was an aesthetic one. Parliament didn't just abolish the monarchy, they liquidated the collection. In a massive, calculated move, the state sold off Charles's art. Masterpieces were auctioned to European buyers. Symbols of royal divinity turned into cold cash. The message was clear. The illusion is over. The gallery is closed. Monarchy is not eternal. It can be catalogued, appraised, and dismantled like any other institution. The sale was brutal. It scattered some of the greatest artworks in British history across the continent. And yet, the echoes of Charles's obsession survived. Many pieces were recovered after the Restoration in 1660. Others never returned. But the legacy endured, in the way future monarchs approached image, display, and the careful curation of public space. Was Charles I collecting an addiction? By the standards of his time, perhaps not. But by any modern lens, the signs are there. The scale, the centrality of the behavior, the emotional investment, the inability to prioritize anything else. It wasn't just love of art. It was dependency on appearance. He didn't just want to be remembered. He wanted to be seen, exactly as he saw himself, regal, sacred, untouchable. And so, when the executioner's axe fell, it didn't just sever a head, it shattered an illusion. But illusions are resilient. And sometimes, they reassemble themselves, not with paintings or portraits, but with experiments, clocks, and the obsessive tinkering of a monarch who found solace not in art, but in science. Let's move from canvas to chemistry. Charles II is waiting. 8. Charles II. Charles II didn't paint himself into divine mythos like his father. He didn't pretend to be a living portrait. He didn't even bother with saintly illusions. He knew better. He'd seen where that got people, his own father's head on the chopping block. Charles II was a different kind of monarch, a realist, a pragmatist, a man who had lived through exile, loss, and humiliating return, and who knew exactly how fragile a crown could be. But that didn't mean he was stable, because Charles II had obsessions too, not with power or performance, but with experiment, with the alchemy of control. He turned his palace into a laboratory. He filled his court with clocks, tubes, and chemical apparatus. And at the heart of it all was a king who couldn't stop tinkering, with machines, with nature, with time itself. It wasn't public scandal. It wasn't palace gossip. It was far weirder. Charles's obsession with science began in exile. While his father was being tried and executed, Charles was bouncing between the courts of Europe, watching as monarchies collapsed and rose like empires of sand. He had no real power, no throne, nothing permanent. What he did have was time, and a growing fascination with the why of things. Why did planets move the way they did? Why did certain metals behave strangely in fire? Why did time, when measured by candle or clock, always seem to betray the human body? When he returned to England in 1660 as the Merry Monarch, most assumed his priorities would revolve around parties, pleasures, and rebuilding royal authority. And he did all of that. But beneath the velvet and wine was a king obsessed with the mechanics of the universe. His court was full of courtiers, but also full of natural philosophers. These were not scientists in the modern sense. They were experimenters, dreamers, men trying to measure heat with bladders and weigh air with scales. And Charles didn't just patronize them, he joined them. He founded the Royal Society in 1660, giving it the royal seal of approval and the financial support it needed to begin formalizing what we now call scientific method. But he didn't stop at institutional support. He personally attended demonstrations. He sponsored experiments. He asked questions, difficult ones, sometimes weird ones. He wanted to see how Mercury moved. He wanted to know how time could be measured more accurately at sea. He wanted to build machines that mimicked life. This wasn't an act. Charles genuinely believed that to master the world, one had to understand its workings, not just symbolically, but materially. He thought in mechanisms, in gears, in pendulums, and most of all, in clocks. That's where the compulsion became visible. Clocks were everywhere, dozens of them, possibly hundreds, depending on the palace and who you ask. They chimed day and night. They ticked in halls, rang in bedrooms, marked the minutes of a monarch who seemed determined to dominate time itself. Visitors reported being disturbed by the incessant clamor of timekeeping. Courtiers complained they couldn't sleep for the bells. But Charles liked it. He said little about the noise, but much about precision. He believed that governing time, perfect, mechanical time, was one of the few ways a monarch could still claim dominion over a chaotic world. It's easy to write this off as eccentricity. After all, Charles II was known for his unusual tastes. He kept spaniels in the royal chambers. He loved theatrical performances and filled his court with laughter and scandal. But underneath the showmanship was a man who trusted mechanisms more than men. He had been betrayed before, by Parliament, by allies, by fate. Clocks didn't lie. Experiments didn't shift loyalty. And so he immersed himself in them. He had private laboratories in his palaces, not metaphorical ones, real spaces with bubbling alembics, sulfuric fumes, shelves of copper instruments. He dabbled in metallurgy, in astronomy, in biology. And yes, even in alchemy, though by then it was evolving into early chemistry. What was he looking for? Not gold, not immortality, at least not directly. He was looking for control. Science offered something monarchy couldn't guarantee: reliable cause and effect. Charles didn't just want to be obeyed. He wanted to understand, to see the hidden gears behind nature, to find order in a kingdom that had once torn itself apart over divine rights and ideological fervor. And the more chaotic the court became, with its endless intrigues, plots, scandals, the deeper Charles leaned into his mechanical kingdom. A place of logic, of substance, of certainty. That's where the irony kicks in. Charles II, King of Restoration England, a monarch known for his mistresses, his revels, his witty asides, was, in private, deeply committed to the cold, careful study of things most people never thought about. He might attend a play in the evening, and then, an hour later, be in his lab testing compounds with sulfur and mercury, or measuring pressure with an early barometer. His favorite timekeeper was a marine chronometer, an early attempt to solve the problem of longitude at sea. He was obsessed with navigation, not just for trade or empire, but because it represented a broader philosophical conquest, the taming of uncertainty. And that's the thread running through all of it. Charles wasn't addicted to knowledge in a noble, romantic way. He was addicted to certainty, to the idea that if you measured enough, observed carefully enough, timed accurately enough, the world would reveal its secrets and finally make sense. Because for him, the alternative, the human world, had already failed. He saw what ideology did to countries. He saw what blind faith did to his father. He saw what revolution did to order. So he turned to mechanisms, instruments, data. Even if the data came from turning lead into something that didn't quite become gold. He wasn't alone. Plenty of early modern monarchs dabbled in science. But Charles lived it. He didn't just patronize the Royal Society, he used it. He ordered members to research practical things: naval improvement, urban drainage, plague control. He wanted solutions, not just theories. Was it a problem? That depends on your definition. The court often thought so. Ministers complained that the king was distracted. Some believed he should be focusing more on foreign policy or religious tension. But Charles, ever diplomatic, would smile, nod, and then return to his instruments. Even on his deathbed, legend has it that he apologized to the doctors for dying before they had finished their treatments. That's the kind of man he was, less concerned with legacy, more with method. The experiment was incomplete, and his addiction to clocks? That never waned. Time defined his reign. Time restored him. Time, perhaps, was the only thing he trusted. So yes, Charles II was addicted, but not to indulgence, not to violence, not to power in the traditional sense. He was addicted to systems, to understanding, to the idea that if one could measure the world accurately enough, everything could be fixed, even monarchy. But while Charles looked to the stars in the clock face, another king obsessed over land. Not just land, but fields, soil, gardens. A man so in love with agriculture that his own people nicknamed him Farmer George. And this next royal took his fixation so seriously, it became both mockery and myth. George III is next. 9. George III. George III didn't light cigars or lace his wine with laudanum. He didn't spend his nights in gaming halls or his mornings pickling his liver in champagne. No, George's addiction was subtler, earthier. It came with dirt under the fingernails and a pencil behind the ear. His great compulsion, his life-structuring, schedule-bending, monarchy-reframing obsession was agriculture. If Charles II sought certainty in the ticking of clocks, George III sought it in the slow rhythm of growing things. Crops, cows, seed drills, pruning shears. This was the king's domain. He wasn't just interested in farming, he was consumed by it. The public knew him as Farmer George, a nickname meant to be both affectionate and a little mocking. He leaned into it. In the court of public opinion, it sounded better than mad. But scratch beneath the surface, and you'll find a royal mind that wasn't simply interested in agriculture, it was structured around it. Let's back up. George III came to the throne in 1760, young, optimistic, and committed to moral seriousness. He rejected the decadence of previous Hanoverian monarchs. No mistresses, no extravagant court life, no gambling scandals. Instead, he promised virtue, stability, and a reign grounded, literally, in the land. The countryside wasn't just symbolic for George, it was political. At a time when cities were swelling and empires expanding, George looked inward, to soil, hedgerows, crop rotation, and the pastoral rhythms of English life. He idealized the farm as the moral center of the kingdom, a place where values were cultivated alongside barley and oats. But this wasn't the nostalgic fantasy of a man who occasionally visited a well-manicured estate. George knew his farming. He read scientific journals on crop yields. He studied manure composition. He took notes on animal husbandry. His interest wasn't romantic, it was technical. He personally oversaw improvements at Kew Gardens and Windsor. He took part in the management of royal estates, sometimes to the frustration of actual estate managers. He funded experiments on plow design and wheat crossbreeding. He engaged with scientists. He walked the fields, not just in ceremonial boots, but with genuine purpose. He was fascinated by the new technologies of the agricultural revolution. Mechanized threshers, seed drills, improved irrigation systems. He wanted to see them implemented. He wanted to know how they worked. He wasn't above asking questions that would have embarrassed other monarchs. Because George wasn't pretending to care about agriculture. He genuinely believed it was the future of the nation and the salvation of the monarchy. Why? Because agriculture, like stamps for his grandson George V or science for Charles II, offered a structure that monarchy could no longer reliably provide. Parliament was gaining strength. The press was becoming bold. The colonies were growing restless, and George, in a system that told him kings were divinely appointed, was now being asked to adapt to a new reality, one in which kings were expected to behave more like national mascots than national rulers. So he dug in, quite literally. By becoming the Farmer King, George III rebranded himself as a man of the people, virtuous, industrious, and connected to the land. It was an image that served him well for a time. Satirists mocked it, of course. Cartoons showed him in a smock, lecturing cows. But there was genuine admiration, too. A monarch who worked, who cared about food production, who asked about drainage ditches. It was refreshing, even revolutionary. But as with all royal fixations, it eventually tipped into something else. What began as passion became routine. What began as curiosity became ritual. George's obsession with agriculture wasn't confined to a few hours each week. It became his default frame of thinking. He spoke of crops in metaphor. He used farm logic in matters of state. He was known to discuss harvests during meetings that had nothing to do with the land. Staff and advisors began to notice. Ministers rolled their eyes behind closed doors. Farmer George was no longer a compliment. It was a liability. The king's priorities seemed misaligned with the world's. While France simmered with revolution and America burned with rebellion, George was fine-tuning composting strategies. Of course, it wasn't farming that lost the colonies, but it was farming that seemed to soothe him. And when his mental health declined, as it famously did, his obsession with agriculture didn't disappear. It intensified. During his infamous periods of illness, recorded in painful detail by doctors and attendants, George reportedly returned obsessively to topics of farming. He spoke endlessly about crops, about the state of fields he hadn't walked in months, about soil composition, about imaginary yields. He asked for updates on estate livestock, even when he was not lucid enough to remember his ministers' names. Modern historians are careful with retrospective diagnoses, but the pattern is hard to ignore. Agriculture wasn't just a royal interest. It became a fixation tethered to his identity, a form of mental scaffolding that held him up when everything else collapsed. And still, the monarchy protected the image. The narrative became one of simple rural virtue, a king in tune with the land, a moral counterpoint to the excesses of the aristocracy. There was no talk of compulsion, no mention of how often he checked in on farm reports, no public discussion of how his conversations circled back to sheep breeding during cabinet crises. Because the idea of a monarch losing himself in manure statistics was better than the alternative, a monarch losing himself, period. Even after his health declined permanently in the early 19th century, the Farmer George persona endured. Paintings of the king in pastoral settings circulated long after he could function in public. The narrative stuck. Here was a king who understood his people because he understood their land. But did he? George III's agricultural obsession wasn't truly about empathy. It was about control. In a monarchy increasingly symbolic, increasingly challenged, George clung to the one realm where outcomes could be measured, where labor bore fruit, where process led to product. Farming made sense. Politics did not. His obsession created legacy. He helped institutionalize royal interest in scientific agriculture. He laid groundwork that would benefit Kew Gardens for centuries. He brought dignity, if also eccentricity, to the idea that monarchs could concern themselves with more than parades and proclamations. But it also revealed something deeper and more troubling. A monarch choosing crops over crisis, who found stability in wheat yields, but faltered when confronted with human complexity. And that tension, that desire to escape unpredictability by retreating into an obsession, isn't unique to George. It runs through the royal line like an underground river, bubbling up in surprising, oddly specific ways. And sometimes it looks like hoarding cloth of gold garments. Because before Farmer George spent his days knee-deep in soil, another king, one supposedly frugal, was blowing absurd amounts of money on luxury shopping. Next is Henry VII. Not the miser history promised, but a compulsive spender in disguise. 10. Henry VII. Henry VII has a reputation problem. Not because he was scandalous, not in the usual royal sense. He didn't chase mistresses. He didn't host wild banquets. He didn't die in debt or on the wrong side of a scandalous court case. In fact, his image has long been defined by the exact opposite: restraint, cold calculation, and legendary frugality. A man so miserly, so fiscally disciplined, that it became part of the national myth. The first Tudor king, we're told, was an obsessive saver, a ledger-balancing sovereign who kept the crown solvent while everyone else was busy beheading cousins or bankrupting the realm. But here's the twist. That image of the miser king in a dusty room counting coins in silence is mostly propaganda. Or rather, it's selective storytelling. Because recent reassessments of Tudor financial records show something a bit stranger, and frankly more human. Henry VII was not just a penny pincher. He was a compulsive spender. But only on certain things. Expensive, luxurious, image-polishing things. In other words, the man who scolded others for their excesses, who built his rule on the foundation of fiscal responsibility, may have been secretly addicted to shopping. Not shopping as in cartloads of trinkets and baubles, shopping as ritualized political theater, carried out through meticulous purchases of cloth of gold, imported velvets, exotic furs, and an almost compulsive collection of prestige items. It wasn't indiscriminate. It was targeted, selective, and that made it look deliberate, until you noticed the pattern. Let's step back. Henry VII came to power in 1485 with one core mission: survival. He had won the crown through conquest, not lineage. The Tudors were a shaky new dynasty built on the ruins of the Wars of the Roses. Henry knew his claim was thin. He couldn't afford chaos. So he made a political philosophy out of caution. He avoided war. He kept the nobility in check. He rebuilt the treasury, and he did it all with the demeanor of a man who, by all appearances, didn't care for pleasure. Cold, reserved, emotionally remote. But behind the accounting books was a different story. Henry spent lavishly on clothes. His wardrobe expenses, meticulously recorded in the royal accounts, are filled with entries for silks, satins, precious fabrics, custom embroidery, and cutting-edge Italian tailoring. One royal tailor, unnamed but well paid, received a small fortune for producing elaborate garments, many of which were worn only once. And it wasn't just about looking nice, it was about looking untouchable. Henry VII used fashion as armor. Every stitch, every jewel-encrusted sleeve, every velvet-lined cloak was a symbol of control. A performance of majesty so complete, it distracted from how insecure the Tudor claim to the throne really was. But at some point, it became more than strategy. The purchases kept coming. More fabrics, more jewels, more imported gloves, more tailored garments. For court appearances no one would remember. The king, who was supposedly terrified of wasting money, seemed completely incapable of resisting certain forms of conspicuous consumption. Historians began to notice the contradiction. How could a man so obsessed with control be spending this much on personal display? Because it wasn't just political, it was personal. Henry VII had lived most of his early life on the run or in exile. He grew up with instability, poverty, risk. His mother, Lady Margaret Beaufort, was a pious, controlling figure. His enemies were many, his allies few. When he seized the crown, he gained something he had never truly known before: certainty. But it was fragile, contested, and it required performance. The court he built wasn't just stable. It was designed, down to the buttons. And Henry himself became the centerpiece, not a king of charisma, but of curated visual power. So he kept spending, even as he squeezed his nobles with bonds and recognizances, legal, financial traps designed to keep them obedient. He funded elaborate court costumes. He bought gilded accessories. He acquired tapestries that cost more than ships. He decorated his surroundings with symbols of wealth and legitimacy, even as he discouraged ostentatious display in others. It's easy to see this as hypocrisy, but it might be something closer to compulsion, because the spending didn't scale back. Not even in the later years of his reign, when his health declined and his paranoia increased. Not even when his son, the future Henry VIII, had already become the new focus of court attention. The garments still arrived. The jewelers were still paid. The tailors still sewed. There's even evidence that Henry would commission outfits and never wear them. They were symbolic, meant to exist, not necessarily to be seen. Possession was the point. Ownership equaled power. This is where the historical reassessment matters. For centuries, Henry VII was viewed as a model of discipline. But behind the financial genius was a man who may have needed the symbolic control of luxury as much as any bacchanalian monarch needed wine. And the spending wasn't just about clothes. He poured funds into architectural projects, carefully designed palaces and chambers that emphasized lineage and legacy. Richmond Palace, for example, was as much a visual thesis statement as it was a royal residence. Even his personal prayer books were elaborate, expensive, and carefully customized. These were not the actions of a man indifferent to material things. These were the behaviors of a man who believed deeply in objects as ideology. Henry's compulsion wasn't chaotic. It wasn't wasteful in the obvious sense. It was targeted, deliberate, and ultimately compulsive in the psychological sense, unable to be stopped. It became a form of governance, a way of managing anxiety, an obsession that passed as policy. And like most royal addictions, it was framed in the best possible light. The miser myth survived because it was useful. It explained Henry's tight grip on his court. It justified the fiscal tools he used to consolidate power. It created a tidy contrast with his notoriously lavish son, Henry VIII. It gave the impression of balance, maturity, and long-term thinking. But the evidence, buried in the expense books, woven into fabric orders, painted in gold leaf on forgotten chapel ceilings, suggests something else. A king with a deeply structured emotional dependence on symbolic luxury. A man whose insecurities were stitched into every robe. A monarch who outspent expectations not because he misunderstood restraint, but because restraint only worked when it was wrapped in velvet. Which brings us to another royal addiction dressed in smoke and routine. Because if Henry VII buried anxiety under layers of silk, his descendant Edward VIII buried it in cigarettes, in drawer after drawer of carefully framed detachment. The addiction wasn't to rebellion. It was to the illusion of control. And the price of that illusion? It would eventually cost him his crown. 11. Edward VIII. Edward VIII was always going to be a problem. Even before he was king, even before he became the Duke of Windsor, even before the abdication crisis sent shockwaves through the institution he was born to inherit, Edward had already begun writing the script for his own downfall, one cigarette at a time. He was, in public, the modern prince, dashing, athletic, restless, with the sharp, angular look of a man designed for front-page spreads. He smiled with his whole face. He posed for cameras like he meant it. He shook hands like it mattered. And through it all, he smoked. He smoked constantly. In many photographs from the 1920s and 30s, Edward is pictured with a cigarette either in hand or just out of frame. It wasn't incidental. The cigarette was part of his persona. Not a filthy habit, but a kind of prop, a signal of confidence, of modernity, of suave detachment. He wasn't the stuffy monarch in waiting. He was the man who could handle foreign leaders, fashion designers, and Fleet Street, all with a cigarette hanging from the corner of his mouth. But behind that curated image was a deeper, quieter truth. Edward VIII was a compulsive smoker, and it shaped not only his health but his psychology, his relationships, his choices, his need for control in a life otherwise governed by royal constraint. It began early. Smoking had long been normalized among the aristocracy. His father, George V, smoked heavily. So did his brother, George VI. So did almost every senior male figure in his life. At the time, the cigarette was a mark of sophistication, masculinity, and worldliness. And Edward, ever the aspirational modern man, embraced it with both lungs. But where others smoked socially, Edward smoked systematically. Biographers, doctors, and palace staff all observed the sheer volume of his habit. Not the occasional cigarette, not a few after dinner, but dozens per day, consumed with the same kind of quiet intensity you might expect from someone, trying to regulate an internal state rather than indulge a pleasure. Because for Edward, the cigarette wasn't just ritual, it was armor. He used it to punctuate his presence, to pause conversations, to assert control in rooms where he often felt emotionally cornered. The monarchy, for all its privilege, gave him very little room to be himself. From an early age, he was told how to walk, speak, smile, dress. He was told whom to court, what to say, what to never admit out loud. The cigarette gave him space, a pause, a prop, a moment to retreat, even in public. The symbolism grew even stronger during the 1930s. Edward, by then Prince of Wales and rising national obsession, leaned fully into his public persona, the people's prince, the new kind of royal. Less stiff, less ceremonial, more connected to modern life. He posed with working men, visited factories, toured deprived areas with photographers in tow, and always, he smoked. No one dared call it addiction. The word would have been vulgar. Instead, it was framed as taste, as independence, as masculine style. But insiders knew better. Edward's cigarette habit wasn't a casual indulgence. It was compulsive, scheduled, and non-negotiable. Staff were expected to anticipate it. Ashtrays were placed as routinely as flower arrangements. His clothes often carried the faint smell of tobacco, even at official engagements. And when his personal life began to spiral into controversy, the smoking intensified. Wallis Simpson, twice divorced American, famously unapproved by the establishment, wasn't just his romantic partner. She was, in a strange way, a co-conspirator in image control. Together, they built a vision of modern royalty that deliberately defied the expectations of tradition. They were glamorous, jet-setting, cynical, worldly, and always photographed with drinks and cigarettes. Theirs was a brand of sophistication that stood in contrast to the heavily moderated, morally upright royal image the institution preferred. But beneath the glamour was strain. Edward's role was increasingly untenable. The government was nervous. The church was hostile. The press was sharpening its knives. Edward, facing pressure from every angle, found himself in a psychological no-man's land. A king without real authority. A man without private refuge. The cigarette became more than ever a companion. A stabilizer. A necessary pause in a life where the pace of decisions threatened to spin out of control. Even during the abdication crisis of 1936, when constitutional and personal disaster collided, the image remained fixed, calm, controlled, dignified. The king's voice on the radio, announcing his departure from the throne, was smooth and composed. What no one saw, what the cameras didn't capture, was that behind the microphone, he was chain-smoking. After the abdication, his smoking didn't ease, it increased. As the newly minted Duke of Windsor, Edward traveled extensively. He played the role of exiled nobleman with flair, but the pressure of life outside the crown, where attention followed but authority vanished, left him with little to anchor himself. He continued smoking through diplomatic trips, wartime embarrassments, and an increasingly isolated old age. It's worth noting that Edward was not unaware of the risks. As public health awareness about smoking began to rise mid-century, there's some evidence he dismissed it with the same ironic detachment he used for most criticism. Like many of his generation, he had no intention of stopping. The habit had become part of him, a behavioral reflex that shaped his posture, his tone, his timing. Doctors worried. His lungs suffered. But the habit continued. Why does this matter? Because Edward's story is often told as one of romantic rebellion. The king who gave up the throne for love. The monarch undone by the heart. But that story, convenient as it is, glosses over the emotional complexity of a man who didn't know how to cope with the tension between image and reality. Smoking was the visible edge of a much deeper need for control through routine. A minor vice in the public eye, but privately, a pacifier. An avoidance. A mechanism for functioning in a system that had demanded performance over authenticity since the moment he could walk. And like so many royal compulsions, it was treated as acceptable, because it was elegant, photogenic, predictable. But it wasn't harmless. Edward's later years were marked by chronic illness, diminished influence, and the lingering presence of a media that had once adored him and now mostly ignored him. The cigarettes never left. He died with them, still a part of his routine. And yet, no official biographies framed it as addiction. No documentaries linger on it. Because the institution, even in exile, preferred narrative neatness. It's easier to say he lost the throne for love than to admit he may have slowly lost himself long before that, in smoke, in performance, in the quiet repetition of a habit that felt like control. And that illusion of control? It haunted more than just Edward. Because while he burned through cigarettes, his brother, George VI, was quietly burning through his own supply, pack after pack, as the pressures of sudden kingship took their toll on body, mind, and voice. The addiction didn't skip a generation, it just changed hands. 12. George VI. George VI did not want the job. He did not want the cameras. He did not want the crown. He did not want to be a living symbol of an empire rapidly coming apart at the seams, and he certainly didn't want to follow his older brother, Edward VIII, who had abdicated with one last romantic flourish, leaving behind a monarchy in PR crisis mode. George wasn't built for attention. He was private, introverted, anxious. A man who stammered under pressure, who preferred silence to spectacle. But the throne didn't care. In 1936, with barely any warning, the Duke of York became King George VI. And almost overnight, A man who'd spent most of his life avoiding the spotlight found himself installed at the very center of it. He turned to cigarettes. More precisely, he relied on them. Because what had once been a background habit quickly became a full-blown dependency. Quiet, constant, and ultimately lethal. George VI was a heavy smoker in a royal line of heavy smokers, but unlike others in the dynasty, he smoked not out of social fashion or aesthetic performance. He smoked because it was the only thing that made the pressure tolerable. You can trace his dependence like a watermark behind every photograph, every broadcast, every carefully rehearsed appearance. He would speak to ministers, nerves barely held in check, then step out of frame and light up. He would review troops, his shoulders tight with tension, then slip into his car and ask for another cigarette. The cigarettes weren't indulgence, they were regulation. Nicotine as emotional scaffolding, one drag at a time. And no one stopped him. Because it was the 1930s and smoking was everywhere. Fashionable, masculine, and medically misunderstood. The health consequences we now take for granted were barely whispered then, even by doctors. For a king under immense pressure, lighting another cigarette wasn't seen as a red flag. It was seen as relief. Necessary. Natural. After all, George VI was not born to reign. He was born to support. As the second son, he had been raised in the long shadow of Edward, less confident, less charming, more reserved. His early years were marked by physical ailments and a pronounced stammer that made public speaking excruciating. His tutors were frustrated. His father, George V, was unsympathetic. The monarchy didn't know how to raise emotionally sensitive boys. They knew how to raise symbols. So George smoked. He took it up young, and by the time he reached adulthood, the habit had fully taken root. It was there through his naval service, through his marriage, and into his years as Duke of York. It was there when the abdication crisis tore through Buckingham Palace and he was drafted, with barely a moment to protest, into the role of king. The palace needed him to be solid, dependable, a return to seriousness after Edward's scandal. George delivered. He played the part with careful precision. He redefined royal duty not with glamour, but with quiet constancy. And all the while, he smoked. The stress of war accelerated everything. World War II became the crucible of George VI's reign. He stayed in London during the Blitz, walking through the bombed-out rubble, visiting hospitals, meeting citizens. The public adored him for it. He was seen as stoic, fatherly, the very embodiment of calm under fire. But privately, he was struggling. The pressure was immense. The stakes were existential. And his body, though disciplined, was absorbing all of it. He smoked even more. Reports from aides and biographers suggest a rate of 30 to 40 cigarettes a day, sometimes more. Always hand-rolled, always within reach. His fingers, perpetually stained. His lungs, perpetually overworked. Even in meetings, even during travel, even in the brief quiet moments between broadcasts, he lit up. It wasn't just physical, it was psychological. George had few outlets. He wasn't a confider. He didn't rant. He didn't cry in public. Cigarette became his private ritual, a moment of control in a life otherwise dictated by duty and surveillance. It calmed his nerves. It steadied his voice. It gave him something to do with his hands when his thoughts threatened to spiral. It also destroyed his health. By the late 1940s, the damage was visible. He developed a persistent cough, then more severe respiratory symptoms. Doctors noticed, but the diagnosis came late. In 1949, he underwent surgery to improve circulation. In 1951, a part of his lung was removed. The press downplayed it. The palace issued vague statements. The monarchy still hadn't adjusted to the idea of medical transparency. But behind the scenes, everyone knew. The king's health was in sharp decline and smoking was at the center of it. His heart was struggling. His breathing was labored. His doctors begged him to slow down, to cut back. He didn't. Or perhaps he couldn't. because by then, the habit had become so central to his functioning that removing it would have been like removing a limb. He smoked during recovery. He smoked during brief periods of public engagement. Even as the monarchy prepared contingency plans, even as his daughter Elizabeth began taking on more public duties, George continued the routine. His final years were measured in fatigue and smoke. And then, in February 1952, he died in his sleep. The cause was thrombosis, exacerbated by cancer, a chain reaction of health breakdowns, all tracing back to a compulsion everyone saw, but no one dared name for what it was: addiction. And yet, history treats him kindly, because George VI represented something bigger than his vices. He became the wartime king, the reluctant hero, the quiet strength behind the throne. His smoking was reframed as stress relief. His illness was treated as tragedy. His image, carefully curated in documentaries and royal histories, rarely lingers on the cigarettes. But they were always there. You can see them in the corners of press, photos, on his desk during wartime broadcasts, in ashtrays just out of frame in newsreels. The monarchy, as always, managed the optics. The public saw dignity. What they didn't see was the dependency just beneath it. Because George VI's story is not one of indulgence. It's one of compromise. He gave everything the monarchy demanded: his voice, his health, his privacy, and in return, he took whatever small comforts he could control: a pack of cigarettes, a moment alone, a breath, however short, that felt like his own. And so, the pattern continued, because while George tried to hold the line, his son, and even his own father, had already been caught in the same spiral. The cigarettes didn't start with him, and they wouldn't end there. Which brings us, rather uncomfortably, to a king so associated with smoke that the air in his presence was said to be unbreathable. Edward VII is next, and with him, the royal habit became something bigger than routine. It became ritualized identity. 13. Edward VII. Edward VII did not just smoke. He embodied smoking. If George VI's cigarettes were quiet crutches behind a burdened reign, and Edward VIII's were stylish props in a life of curated rebellion, then Edward VII's were part of the royal furniture, as omnipresent as portraits and chandeliers, as expected as bow ties and monocles. Where Edward went, so did the smoke. And if it didn't go with him, he would simply stop until it did. He lit his first cigar long before he ever came near a throne. As Prince of Wales, he had decades, literal decades, of free time, public appearances, dinners, affairs, and ceremonial duties to fill. And he filled many of them with smoke. In his era, smoking was aristocratic shorthand for leisure, power, and controlled vice. Cigars, in particular, carried the weight of class. The working classes smoked cigarettes. Gentlemen smoked cigars. Edward smoked both. He was equal opportunity when it came to tobacco. Cigarettes in the morning, cigars in the afternoon and evening, pipe smoke if the mood struck him. And not one or two per day, but dozens. Estimates vary, but some contemporaries suggested upward of 20 cigars and 12 to 15 cigarettes per day during his peak years. This wasn't a passing phase or a seasonal indulgence. This was identity. If you were drawing a caricature of Edward VII in his prime, you'd sketch three things: a rounded figure in a tailored suit, a woman on one arm, and a cigar between his fingers. His friends knew. His ministers knew. Even his mother, Queen Victoria, who disapproved of nearly everything about her son, understood that tobacco was one of the few areas in which he would not yield. She had once tried to get him to reduce his intake. He politely ignored her, or, more likely, not so politely. His habit shaped the court itself. Edward surrounded himself with fellow smokers. Gentlemen's clubs, dining rooms, and drawing rooms all made allowances for the sheer volume of his intake. He was known to light a cigar mid-conversation, sometimes mid-dinner. If you objected, you were the problem, not him. At formal dinners, ashtrays were placed with the same care as cutlery. His personal attendants ensured a supply of cigars that followed him between residences. Aides had to factor tobacco breaks into scheduling. His personal physician worried and was ignored. It would be easy to say this was just the fashion of the time. And yes, smoking was wildly popular in late Victorian and Edwardian England. But Edward's relationship with tobacco went further. It wasn't casual. It was compulsive, structured into the rhythm of his day with the kind of regularity usually reserved for meals and monarchical protocol. This was a man who once delayed an important state function because his preferred brand of cigars hadn't been delivered on time. It would almost be funny if it weren't so revealing. Because behind the jovial persona, the witty, well-fed, cosmopolitan prince who eventually became a king, was someone who needed ritual more than he needed responsibility. Smoking gave him that ritual. It grounded him. In the blur of engagements, scandals, dinners, and diplomatic theater, lighting a cigar was a moment of personal sovereignty, and like many royals with compulsions, Edward had learned to ritualize dependency into charm. He turned smoking into a performative behavior. Holding a cigar during meetings made him seem relaxed, unbothered, casually authoritative. Puffing during conversations gave him pacing, control, dramatic pause. It was theater, but it was also genuine. He wasn't performing the habit. He had become it. When he finally took the throne in 1901, after one of the longest apprenticeships in royal history, he was already past 60, and his lifestyle, built over decades of smoking, eating, and grand living, had left its marks. His health was poor, his breathing was irregular, his weight had ballooned, and still he smoked. His doctors warned him. Nicotine dependence was not yet fully understood in modern terms, but the physical effects were becoming undeniable. He had chronic bronchitis. He experienced regular coughing fits. His arteries showed signs of strain, and he responded to these warnings the way Edward VII responded to most things that threatened his comfort. He ignored them, because in his mind, smoking was not the problem. Smoking was part of what kept him going. It soothed the nerves. It helped him think. It marked the hours. It was, in a sense, his therapy, one he trusted more than any actual doctor. And the court, as always, made accommodations. Even late into his reign, when health concerns grew more serious, Edward refused to cut back. His staff simply adjusted. Rooms were ventilated. Meetings shortened. His tobacco supply was regulated not in terms of health but availability. He was a king with the lung function of a chimney, and still, he insisted on lighting up. When he died in 1910, it was officially attributed to bronchitis exacerbated by heart disease. Quietly, the smoking was acknowledged as a contributing factor, though never publicly criticized. After all, this was Edward the Peacemaker, the elegant monarch who helped stabilize Europe through diplomacy, charisma, and courtly theater. It wouldn't do to dwell too much on the cloud of smoke that followed him wherever he went. And so, as with many royal compulsions, the narrative was softened. The habit was reframed as culture, a distinguished vice, something befitting a man of the world. But the truth sits in the margins. Edward VII's smoking wasn't just heavy, it was relentless. He didn't moderate. He didn't slow. He organized his life around the habit, and when doctors began to push for moderation, he declined with a royal shrug. Because for Edward, smoking was more than enjoyment. It was structure. It was power. It was a habit that bent the court to his needs, not the other way around. And the monarchy, though, as usual, adapted. Even his son, George V, picked up the habit and then passed it on. Because in royal life, addictions aren't always viewed as threats. Sometimes they're treated as tradition. And so, Edward VII's legacy lingered, sometimes literally, in the air. Which brings us next to his son, George V, the serious one, the stamp collector, the model of royal discipline. But even he wasn't immune. Because while George V carefully preserved the monarchy's image through catalogued philately, he too inhaled the family habit, cigarette after cigarette, ritual after ritual, until it became something far more dangerous than tradition. 14. George V. George V was supposed to be the antidote. After Edward VII's long, smoke-wreathed reign of aristocratic indulgence and diplomatic schmoozing, the monarchy needed a dose of discipline. A bit of sobriety. Fewer cigars, fewer scandals, more stability. And George V, his second son, the spare who unexpectedly became the heir, was perfectly cast for the role. He was quieter, more reserved, unapologetically traditional. Where his father filled rooms with laughter and cigar smoke, George filled them with silence and punctuality. He didn't charm, he administered. He didn't throw lavish parties. He kept detailed schedules and filed letters with military precision. But for all the differences, the smoke never really left. Because George V, the king who cultivated an image of restraint and seriousness, was also a heavy smoker. Less flamboyant than his father, perhaps, but no less dependent. His cigarettes weren't flashy accessories or social cues. They were more like equipment, essential to function, seamlessly integrated into every room he entered, every meeting he held, every pause between royal duties. He was said to have smoked all day, every day. No dramatic flair, no cigar-pointing anecdotes, just the steady, quiet burn of habit. It's one of the stranger contradictions in royal storytelling. George V, the monarch of continuity, the unshakable anchor through World War I and constitutional reform, was also deeply entrenched in nicotine dependence. But because his version of addiction wasn't photogenic or scandalous, it was allowed to pass as personality. His reign began in 1910 under the heavy expectation of cleanup. The monarchy had survived Edward VII's exuberant rule with its dignity mostly intact, but the press was growing louder, republicanism was quietly gaining traction, and modernity was creeping into British life with unnerving speed. George V's answer? Control everything. And that meant everything. Dress codes, scheduling, state papers, public appearances, royal Christmas traditions, even the exact placement of paperweights on desks. He reshaped the monarchy into a more austere, more managed institution. Less spectacle, more ritual. Less charm, more continuity. But even the most buttoned-up kings need an outlet. And for George, that outlet was filtered through smoke. Cigarettes became part of his emotional plumbing. They structured his day. A way to breathe between duties, or at least appear to. Staff quickly adapted to his habits. Ashtrays were kept immaculately placed. Courtiers were expected to anticipate his smoking preferences. The king's study always had a faint smell of tobacco, woven into the furniture, the curtains, even the paper. And as with many royal compulsions, no one dared intervene. Because George V was a man of consistency, and to disrupt that consistency, no matter how unhealthy, felt unthinkable. By all accounts, he was not a man of big emotions. He was formal with his children, courteous but distant with staff, and rarely expressive in public. His affection was rarely verbal, his praise even rarer. The cigarette, in a strange way, stood in for intimacy. It gave him pause, space, something to do when words weren't enough or weren't appropriate. He smoked through conversations, through family gatherings, through cabinet briefings. It wasn't an event. It was simply part of the man. And like his father before him, George's smoking was more than a routine. It was a reflex, not just physical, but psychological, especially during the war. World War I placed enormous strain on the monarchy. Anti-German sentiment surged. The royal family's Germanic surname, Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, suddenly became a political liability. In 1917, George took the bold step of rebranding the family name to Windsor, scrubbing away German associations with a single stroke of PR brilliance. It worked. The monarchy weathered the storm. But behind the composed, public image, George was reportedly exhausted, haunted by the pressures of wartime leadership and the collapse of cousin monarchies across Europe. Russia, Germany, Austria-Hungary. All gone. All royal cousins. All reminders that crowns were no longer immune to consequence. And through it all, he smoked. The habit, already deep-rooted, became more entrenched. The quiet act of lighting a cigarette became a kind of meditative gesture. A brief moment of solitude in a life where nearly every other moment was choreographed. His health, predictably, began to show signs of strain. By the mid-1920s, George V suffered repeated bouts of bronchitis. His voice grew weaker. His energy faltered. Yet he continued his duties, continued his routines, and, of course, continued smoking. Because the monarchy doesn't bend easily. And neither did he. Doctors expressed concern. His family noticed the physical toll. But as with many men of his generation, and many royals in particular, George V treated health warnings as background noise. The cigarette stayed. By the time he entered his 60s, the damage was evident. His breathing became increasingly labored. He developed chronic lung issues. In 1928, he suffered a serious bout of septicemia, which left him bedridden for months. And yet, even as his body rebelled, the habit endured. Because by then, it wasn't just about pleasure. It was about identity maintenance. The calm, unflappable king could not be seen unraveling. The cigarettes helped maintain the illusion, even if they were slowly killing him. His final years were marked by increasing frailty, though the public was shielded from much of it. Behind palace walls, he moved more slowly. He tired easily. His voice cracked. And he kept smoking. When he died in January 1936, after a long illness, the official cause was recorded as bronchial infection and heart failure. Unofficially, everyone knew the cigarettes were a major factor, but the press, out of deference, didn't linger on that. His legacy was framed around duty, wartime leadership, and his successful efforts to modernize the monarchy without undermining its mystique. The smoke was part of the scenery, not part of the story. And that's the enduring irony. George V, monarch of order, of image, of routine, was consumed by the same compulsion that had shaped and shortened the lives of both his father and his sons. But because he wrapped it in silence and consistency, it was never quite labeled as addiction. It was just him. That's how addiction survives in royal households. Not by hiding in the shadows, but by being treated as unremarkable. And so, while George V's addiction took his health, it left his legacy untouched. His story became one of quiet strength and imperial grace. The nicotine stains on his fingers never made the history books. But they were there. In every treaty signed. In every speech rehearsed. In every photo where he stood stiff, expressionless, holding a cigarette like it was part of his uniform. Which brings us to someone else who wore their addiction less as armor and more as rumor. A royal whose struggle with drugs became the stuff of whispered legend, half-truth, and enduring speculation. Let's talk about Prince George, Duke of Kent, and the secret history of a royal who may have danced too close to the edge. 15. Prince George, Duke of Kent. Prince George, Duke of Kent, was the royal who didn't fit the mold, not because he tried to overthrow the government or rewrite the Constitution, or sell family jewels for fast cars. He didn't need to. His scandal wasn't about treason. It was about rumor. A swirl of whispered addiction, whispered relationships, whispered breakdowns, none of which ever stuck firmly enough to enter official record, and all of which stuck just enough to never really go away. He was the fourth son of King George V. Born in 1902, he was royal, yes, but not burdened by the immediate expectation of the throne. And unlike his father or elder brothers, George didn't seem particularly interested in tradition. Where others obeyed, he wandered. Where others stiffened, he relaxed. He was strikingly good-looking, unusually fashionable, and conspicuously cosmopolitan for a royal in the early 20th century. In photographs, he looked more like a movie star than a duke. He spoke multiple languages. He partied with aristocrats and artists. He had a weakness for uniforms that actually fit. And while his siblings carved out lives defined by duty and discomfort, George appeared to enjoy himself, perhaps a bit too much, because behind the polished exterior and effortless charm was a reputation that, even by royal standards, veered into troubled territory. Not officially, of course, but quietly, persistently. At the center of it all was the rumor of drug addiction. Let's be clear, no royal biography, palace archive, or official statement ever confirmed that Prince George was addicted to anything. But that's precisely what makes the whispers so powerful. The lack of evidence didn't erase the claim. It made it more intriguing, more dangerous. The vacuum of proof allowed speculation to flourish, and by the mid-20th century, speculation had grown into a shadow narrative. The most common allegation? That Prince George developed a dependence on morphine and cocaine in the interwar years, first recreationally, then compulsively. And the sources for this rumor? Scattered. Some came from memoirs by people who knew him, some from journalists repeating hearsay, some from later historians trying to piece together a personality that never quite added up. One biographer described the rumor as persistent, and that's the most accurate word we have. Persistent, unverified, never confirmed, never fully denied. The palace, naturally, remained silent. Addiction was not a subject for public consumption, especially not in royal circles. Acknowledging it would have meant admitting that royal blood offered no protection from the same struggles faced by ordinary people. That would have shattered the illusion. But the illusion had already cracked, because George didn't just fraternize with elites. He moved in circles that made the monarchy deeply uncomfortable. Actors, musicians, artists, intellectuals, people who smoked more than cigarettes, people who drank more than tea. He was seen at clubs where discretion was the currency. He attended private events where boundaries blurred and the air was thick with more than smoke. He was also known to disappear for stretches, unexplained absences from royal life, breaks that didn't fit into any official schedule. Some said it was health. Others whispered rehab, in the way people do when they don't want to say the word directly. Again, no records exist. But the pattern was suspicious. He was present, then absent. Active, then suddenly removed. He would return to public life as if nothing had happened, smiling, dressed impeccably, unbothered. But beneath that polished exterior, many suspected chaos. He had a long list of rumored romantic entanglements, both men and women. Some confirmed, some denied, some simply too messy to clarify. His relationship with his wife, Princess Marina of Greece and Denmark, was real, but complicated. They had children. They performed their royal duties. But insiders suggested it was more of an arrangement than a romance. Meanwhile, the whispers kept circulating that George was unstable, emotionally volatile, reliant on substances to maintain his carefully constructed composure. Even if none of it was technically proven, the rumor itself became part of his identity. And that's what sets Prince George apart. He didn't need to confess. He didn't need to be caught. In the public imagination, he might have been addicted. That possibility was enough to write him into the history of royal compulsion, because even as the palace tried to project unity, tradition, and continuity, George was a quiet reminder that some royals lived behind different curtains, where expectations didn't restrain behavior, only concealed it, where the line between coping mechanism and public persona blurred. And then, at 39, he died. The year was 1942. World War II was in full swing. George, who had returned to active duty in the Royal Air Force, was flying on official business when his plane crashed in Scotland. 13 people were on board. Only one survived. George was not the survivor. The official report blamed the crash on poor visibility and navigation errors. The tragedy was framed as a wartime sacrifice, deeply mourned, patriotically framed. But even in death, the whispers didn't stop. Some said he shouldn't have been on the flight, that he wasn't fit to fly, that the trip had been unnecessary, that his presence was unexplained. Others speculated about the survivor. Why had he made it? What had he seen? What hadn't he said? The conspiracy theories are speculative and mostly unverifiable, but they tell us something. People didn't believe the official story, or rather, they believed there was more to it, that something had been hidden, that addiction, or instability, or something darker had played a role. Again, no proof, but the lack of proof only fueled the legend. Today, Prince George is rarely discussed outside royal genealogy charts or footnotes in biographies of his better-known relatives. But when he is mentioned, it's almost always with a cloud of speculation. The drug rumors, the wild lifestyle, the mysterious death. He represents something we rarely see so clearly in royal history, a life that didn't fit the script, and so was quietly trimmed from the official narrative. A royal whose compulsion, whatever form it took, didn't become scandal, but instead dissolved into the mist of half-acknowledged legacy. And that, perhaps, is what makes his story so unsettling. Because not all addictions come with consequences that history can cleanly record. Sometimes they exist in the spaces between certainty, between fact and myth, between the official version and the one people can't stop retelling. Which brings us to someone who also lived in that in-between space, not in addiction to substances, but in an obsession so public and yet so private it reshaped her entire life. Because Queen Victoria wasn't addicted to vice, she was addicted to mourning. 16. Queen Victoria. Queen Victoria wore black for 40 years. She wasn't in mourning for a nation. She wasn't attending a string of funerals. She wasn't adhering to a temporary court custom. She was grieving one man, her husband, Prince Albert. And not just grieving him, she was inhabiting that grief, wearing it, living it, refusing to let it pass. What began as mourning became a compulsion. Prince Albert died in 1861, unexpectedly and young, after a short illness that devastated Victoria beyond what anyone around her could fully grasp. The Queen, already prone to intense emotional attachments, didn't just retreat. She constructed a new life, a new identity, around her loss. And for the remaining 40 years of her reign, she made mourning not just a phase but a permanent condition. There are countless royal mourning periods in history. Kings and queens have always grieved spouses, children, dynasties. But Queen Victoria's grief didn't fade with time. It intensified. It formalized. It became ritualistic. Her mourning was so total, so codified, that it reshaped the court, the monarchy, and even the visual culture of an entire empire. Black dresses, black veils, jet jewelry, dark rooms, thick curtains. Silence in the halls. Servants instructed to lay out Albert's clothes each morning, as if he might return. Meals left untouched at his place. Private notes left for a man no longer alive. She didn't just love him. She institutionalized his absence. To the outside world, this may have appeared as extreme devotion, a queen so loyal to her late husband that she refused to let go. But from inside the palace, the pattern was less romantic, more ritualistic, more unmovable, more compulsive. The court initially respected the mourning period. After all, Victoria and Albert had been deeply close. Their marriage, though politically arranged, had grown into a genuine partnership. Albert had acted as her advisor, her confidant, her moral compass. His loss was destabilizing, and a few years of grief were understandable. But then the years became a decade, and then two. And still she wore black. Still she refused to appear in public. Still she pushed ministers away and retreated into correspondence and memory. Still she described herself as half alive. This was not the standard mourning process. It was a new life, structured entirely around what was no longer there. The monarchy became a house of shadows, ruled by a woman who existed in emotional stasis. Politicians grew restless. Public patience wore thin. Newspapers began asking difficult questions. Where is the Queen? Why is she not attending public events? Why are ministers traveling to her instead of the other way around? For a sovereign, visibility is power. Presence is reassurance. But Victoria wasn't interested in public reassurance. She was interested in privacy. Not just privacy of the body, but of the soul. She was consumed. And still, the court adapted. Black became the court dress code. Events were toned down. Portraits were adjusted. Victoria refused to sit for official paintings that showed her smiling. No color, no light, no symbolism of rebirth. Her children worried. Her ministers fumed. But no one could change her. What makes this more than just a psychological footnote is how Victoria's mourning spread outward, how it restructured an entire national identity. Victorian mourning culture became a thing of legend. Rules about what color to wear and when, how long to grieve a parent, a spouse, a sibling, how to decorate a home in bereavement, which materials were morally appropriate. Jet, not diamonds. But these rules didn't appear from nowhere. They were modeled directly on Victoria's own rituals. She didn't just grieve. She created a new genre of monarchy, one rooted in absence, memory, and soft-spoken permanence. And it worked. For a while, public sympathy deepened. People admired her loyalty. Statues of Albert were erected across the empire. Royal mourning became fashionable. An entire industry emerged around the aesthetics of grief. Mourning attire, mourning portraits, mourning jewelry. To mourn like the Queen was to signal moral seriousness, emotional fidelity, devotion that knew no limit. But at what cost? Victoria's fixation with grief had consequences beyond wardrobe. For decades, she resisted returning fully to ceremonial duties. Major state events were delegated, speeches shortened, appearances rare. She remained the figurehead, but often in absentia. Parliament continued, the crown endured, but the monarchy, as a visible, dynamic institution, became more symbolic than functional. And within the palace, the emotional climate froze. Her children, many of whom would go on to rule or marry into other European royal families, grew up under the long shadow of loss ritualized as lifestyle. Some tried to pull her back into public life. Others stopped trying. Only slowly, with time, did she begin to re-emerge. The later years of her reign saw a soft return to visibility, jubilee celebrations, processions, speeches. But even then, the black never left. Her wardrobe remained dark, her moods often low. She never remarried, never referred to another man with the same warmth. Even portraits of her in old age show her dressed as if the funeral was just yesterday. Modern historians struggle with how to classify this. Was it clinical depression, a trauma response, ritualized grief, obsessive behavior? Perhaps all of the above. But whatever it was, it became unquestionable. No one challenged her mourning because it had become, in a sense, sacred. Even the monarchy learned to adapt around it. Victoria's mourning reshaped not only the culture of grief, but the political theater of monarchy. For the first time, a queen was ruling not through presence, but through absence made visible. Her sorrow became state doctrine. Her memory-keeping became national policy, and when she died in 1901, her funeral was not just an end to a reign, it was the conclusion of a 40-year mourning performance. Her legacy wasn't just empire or diplomacy, it was how to grieve at scale, how to take private emotion and turn it into a social institution. But as with all compulsions, what began as coping became routine, and what became routine calcified into identity. Victoria wasn't addicted to sadness. She was addicted to structure. Mourning gave her something stable, predictable, a framework she could control, in a world that had stolen the person who made her feel grounded. And that need for control through personal excess? It didn't die with her. because her descendant, George IV, was just as obsessed with structure. But his came in the form of display, fashion, architecture, excess, and the belief that, with enough fabric and gold leaf, you could make monarchy look eternal, even when the man inside the palace was unraveling. Next, the king who dressed like a god and spent like a gambler and called it governance. 17. George IV, fashion and display as compulsion. George IV was the king who never met a mirror he didn't love or redesign. He wasn't content to be royal. He needed to look royal, breathtakingly so, excessively so, obsessively so. Not just crowned but costumed, choreographed, and consumed by the visual theater of monarchy. George IV didn't merely wear fashion, he weaponized it. He didn't just commission buildings, he constructed palaces around his ego and taste. His reign was an empire of velvet, embroidery, and mirrored ceilings, all hiding the cracks beneath. He was, by most accounts, a compulsive performer, and his stage was everywhere. Born in 1762, George came of age in an era obsessed with surface, powdered wigs, gilded interiors, aristocratic posture. But he took things a step further. As Prince of Wales, then Prince Regent, and finally king from 1820 to 1830, he didn't just indulge in royal style. He disappeared into it. The clothes first. Always the clothes. George IV changed outfits multiple times a day. Not for hygiene, not for function, for the performance. His wardrobes were vast, curated down to the button. He spent exorbitant sums on silks, embroidery, imported fabrics, military-style dress uniforms for occasions that were not remotely military. A French tailor was summoned to ensure his waistcoats had just the right angle of arrogance. His boots were polished obsessively. His accessories, often jeweled, often unnecessary, were ordered in bulk. He wasn't dressing for others. He was dressing to maintain a fantasy, one that required precise visual continuity, that the monarch was always composed, adorned, and untouched by the messiness of real life. George IV's public presence was like an oil painting in motion, rich, static, and impossible to correct without starting over. But his obsession with display wasn't limited to his person. It infected his entire environment. Enter the Brighton Pavilion. This was not a modest royal residence. It was a fever dream of domes, minarets, Chinese wallpapers, dragon chandeliers, and surreal aesthetic collisions. The pavilion was Orientalist fantasy turned into architecture, part pleasure palace, part ego temple. It was designed to impress, confuse, seduce, and overwhelm, and it succeeded on all counts. George didn't just build buildings, he curated worlds. Every room reflected a new facet of his identity as he wished it to be seen. Exotic, regal, commanding, unique. Nothing about the pavilion suggested moderation or necessity. Everything screamed, "You are inside the mind of someone who has never been told no." Of course, all this cost money, a lot of it. By the time George IV ascended to the throne, he was deeply, spectacularly in debt. Over £600,000 by some estimates, tens of millions in today's terms. Parliament reluctantly paid off much of it in exchange for political favors. The public grumbled. Satirists mocked him relentlessly, painting him as a corpulent peacock bleeding the treasury dry. But the king continued, undeterred. To him, appearance was not indulgence. It was necessity, because without his elaborate stage, he had nothing else. Privately, George was miserable. He struggled with health issues, obesity, gout, depression. His relationships were chaotic and strained. He married out of obligation and maintained a series of affairs that generated scandal without satisfaction. He drank heavily. He withdrew socially. And yet, the one thing that never faltered, never dimmed, was the performance. He appeared in ceremonial dress long past the point of comfort. He demanded the construction of new rooms for new wardrobes. He commissioned self-portraits, flattering ones, carefully positioned throughout his homes. As his body deteriorated, he leaned harder into tailoring and illusion. Corsets, layers, sashes. He once wore a military uniform so tight he nearly passed out from restricted breathing. He didn't care. Silhouette mattered more than the lungs inside it. His obsession with visual control extended to painting and portraiture. Artists were hired, fired, rehired, based on how well they could lie with a brush. George wanted to be portrayed as larger than life, not in the metaphorical sense, in the literal, canvas-dominating sense. His official portraits depict a man not plagued by self-doubt or health problems, but a monarch in golden armor, gazing down at you as if carved from legacy itself. It was a lie, and everyone knew it. But the monarchy leaned into the lie, because George IV had figured out something dangerous and effective. If you can't rule with dignity, you can still dazzle. His reign may have been politically fragile and publicly ridiculed, but the stagecraft was immaculate. And in a strange way, the monarchy survived because of it. Despite his reputation for vanity and excess, George IV helped cement royal image-making as a political tool. His compulsive commitment to appearance wasn't a distraction, it was a blueprint. Future royals, particularly in the media age, would rely on the same tactics: the costume, the photo op, the setting, the symbolic gesture. George wasn't the first to do it, but he was the first to do it as a full-time occupation. So was it addiction? Was it compulsion? Modern psychologists might label it as a form of narcissistic behavior, a craving for control through aesthetics. Historians prefer terms like ornamental kingship. But whatever you call it, it was real, and it was relentless. He couldn't stop, even as his finances collapsed, even as public criticism intensified, even as his body failed him. Because the garments, the interiors, the mirrors, those were the only things he could perfect. The only parts of monarchy he could still master. The rest, governance, diplomacy, intimacy, had long since escaped him. And perhaps that's the saddest part. George IV didn't believe in himself, but he believed in image, and so he lived inside one, polishing the frame, adjusting the lighting, spending endless amounts of borrowed money to maintain the illusion of glory that never quite reached his heart. He died in 1830, alone and physically broken, surrounded by the spoils of his own fantasy. The garments still hung in closets. The pavilion still shimmered in its architectural hallucination. But the man behind the curtain had long stopped performing for himself. History remembers him as vain, decadent, and ridiculous. But under the layers of gold braid and velvet, there was a man trying desperately to be enough, not through action or integrity, but through costume and stagecraft. 18. Henry VIII, sporting risk fixation. Henry VIII didn't just rule England, he performed it. He was the very picture of what a Renaissance king believed he should be: muscular, brave, imperious, and above all, dangerous in tights. But under the regal pageantry and political maneuvering, Henry's deepest fixation was not with conquest or succession or reform. It was with risk, specifically physical risk. Public, performative, bruising, ego-charged risk. The kind that involved a horse charging at full speed, a metal pole aimed at another man's chest, and absolutely no plan for aging gracefully. Because Henry VIII didn't just enjoy sports, he was addicted to spectacle through violence, especially when he could be at the center of it. And no event fed that craving quite like the tournament. Let's be clear, jousting wasn't a hobby, it was a political weapon. For a king in the early 16th century, it was proof of masculinity, divine favor, and military virility. The tournament was equal parts sport, theater, and monarchy marketing campaign. Henry used it constantly. He trained obsessively. He designed his own armor. He rode into jousts like he was storming France. And even when his advisors, and later his doctors, urged him to stop, he refused. Because the risk wasn't a side effect. It was the point. He wanted to be seen risking everything over and over again in a ritual of royal athleticism that was equal parts testosterone and theatrics. And the injuries? Well, they came. And they stayed. As a young man, Henry was built like a war god, over 6 feet tall, broad-chested, shockingly agile for a man of royal birth. He ran, jumped, danced, hunted, fenced, and fought. Courtiers compared him to Achilles. Foreign ambassadors wrote home in awe. He wasn't just a monarch. He was England's idea of itself, victorious, youthful, invincible. But his need to prove that image again and again became his own undoing. Jousting was dangerous for everyone. For Henry, it was more so, because he refused to stop even as the stakes grew higher. His first major tournament injury occurred in his 30s, and it was severe. He was knocked from his horse, landed hard, and was reportedly unconscious for hours. His physicians feared brain damage. The court feared a succession crisis. The country held its breath. But Henry survived. And the first thing he did afterward? He got back on the horse. Because to stop jousting would have meant admitting vulnerability, and to admit vulnerability would be to lose the one thing he seemed to value more than anything: control through physical power. His courtiers privately panicked. His counsel quietly suggested alternative forms of exercise. Henry ignored them all. He needed the ritual, the pageantry, the collision of man, beast, and steel. By the time he reached his 40s, Henry's injuries began to compound. He developed chronic leg problems, ulcers, swelling, intense pain, likely caused by earlier falls and aggravated by the pressure to keep performing like a younger man. But he still rode. He still fought. He still refused to accept the body's limits. Because this was not about sport anymore. It was political theater. A statement to his court and his people that their king was still strong, still chosen by God, still capable of physical dominance. The most infamous incident came in 1536. Henry entered a joust in Greenwich. As usual, he wore full armor. As usual, he charged with reckless enthusiasm. And this time, he fell. Hard. The horse crushed him. The impact was brutal. He was knocked unconscious again, some say for 2 hours. The country waited once more to see if its king would wake up. He did. But he was never the same. This injury, the second catastrophic one, changed Henry physically, and many historians argue, psychologically. His legs deteriorated rapidly. He gained weight. He became more paranoid, more volatile, more isolated. It wasn't just the pain, it was the loss of identity. Without the tournaments, without the hunts, without the chance to throw himself into danger to feel powerful, Henry began to unravel. And yet, even as his body broke down, his obsession with physical dominance never left him. He turned his focus to hunting, less dangerous but still performative. He took enormous pride in killing dozens of animals in a single day. He had specially constructed hunting grounds, elaborate equipment, and a retinue of attendants tasked with making him feel like a predator, not a man falling apart. But the cracks were showing. By the end of his reign, Henry VIII was obese, immobile, and plagued by chronic wounds. He could no longer mount a horse. He could barely walk. His once heroic figure was now hidden behind layers of padding, drapery, and increasingly symbolic armor. But the memory of his sporting days, the tournaments, the hunts, the rituals of risk, was preserved carefully in court art, poetry, and legend. It was the myth that had mattered all along. Not the man, but the spectacle. And like so many royal fixations, Henry's obsession with physical risk wasn't framed as addiction in his lifetime. It was framed as virtue, strength, valor, masculinity, divine favor. It wasn't until later, when historians began connecting the dots between his injuries, his moods, his governance style, that the full cost of this compulsion became clear. The jousts were not harmless pageants. They were inflection points, moments where a single fall could change the fate of the realm. And they did. The Henry who dissolved monasteries, beheaded wives, and threatened foreign powers, was also the Henry who couldn't stop hurling himself into violent games that endangered his life and throne. And the monarchy absorbed it all because the image mattered more than the risk. Because in the end, Henry VIII's body was a battlefield, one he decorated like a tournament field and sacrificed like a pawn. And that obsession, risk dressed as ritual, didn't die with him. It simply changed form. Which brings us to another royal who couldn't resist turning his surroundings into a kind of clockwork theater. A man so fascinated with time, he filled his palace with chiming reminders that it was always running out. Next, Charles II and the monarchy's strangest obsession with alchemy, laboratories, and a household full of clocks. 19. Charles II. Obsession with alchemy, laboratories, and clocks. Charles II wasn't supposed to be a king. He was supposed to be a cautionary tale. Born in 1630, he watched his father, Charles I, lose not just his crown but his head, cut off in public by men who had decided monarchy itself was obsolete. For 11 years, England existed without a king. No palace, no scepter, no divine right. Just Oliver Cromwell and a parliament that proved monarchy could be replaced, if not entirely erased. So when Charles II returned from exile in 1660 during the Restoration, it wasn't with a sense of triumph. It was with an awareness of fragility. The monarchy had been resurrected, yes, but the scars were fresh. And Charles, unlike his ancestors, understood that kingship wasn't guaranteed. It had to be maintained, cultivated, reinvented. Which may be why, instead of devoting his energy to wars or religious zealotry, Charles became obsessed with science. But not the science we think of today, no sterile labs or peer-reviewed journals. Charles's brand of science was stranger, older, shadowed by incense and gold leaf manuscripts. It was alchemy. The king became fixated on unlocking the secrets of nature, not for curiosity's sake, but because he believed, perhaps rightly, that the ability to control natural forces could be the next form of royal power. He poured resources into laboratories, commissioned scientists, surrounded himself with thinkers and tinkerers. He became the patron of the newly founded Royal Society, an institution that would go on to define Enlightenment science. But in Charles's time, it still had one foot in mysticism. He wanted to find the philosopher's stone. Not metaphorically, literally. He employed alchemists, funded experiments, kept private chambers stocked with arcane tools, chemicals, and manuscripts. There are records of Charles personally engaging in chemical experiments, mixing metals, burning compounds, taking notes. Some accounts say he dabbled in medical alchemy, seeking universal cures. Others suggest he was trying to manipulate time itself, or at least measure it with a kind of obsessive precision. Which brings us to the clocks. Charles II wasn't just interested in timekeeping, he was fixated on it. His palaces, particularly Whitehall, became saturated with clocks. Big ones, small ones, decorative ones, experimental ones. Some chimed, some ticked softly. Some tracked lunar cycles or planetary positions, and they were everywhere. Visitors to the royal apartments noted the constant sound. Clicks, tocks, chimes, hourly bells. It was said you couldn't stand in any room of Charles's private residence without hearing at least one clock ticking. At night, attendants complained the noise was so relentless they couldn't sleep. Servants whispered that the king's obsession had turned his palace into a mechanical echo chamber. This wasn't normal behavior. Even in an age when clocks were prestige items, Charles's collection was excessive. Decorative? Yes, but also deliberate. He tracked time with ritualistic intensity, as if to remind himself, constantly, how little of it he had. And that makes sense. He was a Restoration monarch. His entire reign was a reminder that monarchy could disappear. Time for Charles wasn't just a measurement, it was a threat, a ghost ticking in the background of every decision. The irony is that, while Charles surrounded himself with the trappings of order, measured minutes, scientific instruments, chemical balance. His actual rule was deeply chaotic. His court was notorious for its excess: parties, mistresses, theatrical performances, midnight feasts. While his predecessors ruled with the Bible and sword, Charles ruled with wit and indulgence. He was called the Merry Monarch, not because he was especially benevolent, but because he understood that performance was survival. If he couldn't be feared like his father, he would be adored, or at least entertained. But beneath the surface, he never stopped trying to unlock the machinery of reality. His patronage of the Royal Society wasn't just fashionable. It was strategic. He believed that science could stabilize monarchy, that rationality could do what religion and politics had failed to achieve: control. Yet his own scientific passions were frequently bizarre. He once kept a private laboratory under the palace, where he conducted experiments late at night. There are stories of him mixing tinctures, experimenting with poisons, testing out cures on animals, and, reportedly, occasionally on condemned prisoners. These accounts are often second-hand and blurry, passed down through court gossip and posthumous biography, but they paint a consistent picture: a king who sought truth not through scripture, but through combustion and curiosity. Why? What was he looking for? Immortality? Control? A way to stay ahead of his enemies? Or maybe just meaning, the kind that can be measured with a pendulum or isolated in a flask. His obsession with time and transformation had a melancholic edge. Charles had no legitimate heirs. His many children, acknowledged and unacknowledged, were born of mistresses, not queens. His relationship with Parliament was rocky. His religious leanings ambiguous. He ruled in the shadow of revolution and died in the shadow of uncertainty. Even at the end, Charles's relationship with science remained strange. On his deathbed in 1685, after a sudden and severe illness, he reportedly apologized to those around him for being such an unconscionable time a-dying. A dry, self-aware quip from a man who had spent his life surrounded by clocks, trying to measure the immeasurable. And then, silence. The ticking stopped. What makes Charles II's obsession so fascinating is how non-scandalous it seemed at the time. He wasn't drunk in public. He didn't bankrupt the country with baccarat. He didn't imprison dissenters over dice games. But his fixation with transformation, of metals, of time, of self, was just as compulsive, just as revealing. He wanted to engineer permanence, in monarchy, in matter, in minutes. But what he built ultimately was a ticking world that couldn't outpace death or disorder. His laboratories fell into disuse. His clocks were sold off or silenced. The Royal Society moved on to real science, and Charles himself became a footnote, an eccentric king, vaguely remembered for his parties, periwigs, and experiments that never quite worked. But maybe that's the lesson. 20. Queen Mary, list-making, labeling, and the compulsion for order. Queen Mary did not trust chaos. She didn't trust memory, instinct, or improvisation either. What she trusted were lists, labels, dockets, index cards, small handwritten notes that turned the world into something sortable, containable, and, most importantly, knowable. If George V soothed himself with stamps, Queen Mary soothed herself by cataloging reality. Not metaphorically, literally. She listed objects. She labeled drawers. She annotated furniture. She documented provenance with the seriousness of a museum registrar and the persistence of someone who could not rest until everything had a name, a place, and a written explanation for why it belonged there. To outsiders, this was efficiency. To insiders, it was something closer to a compulsion. Mary of Teck grew up without certainty. Her family was aristocratic but not wealthy. Titles existed, but money did not always follow. Her childhood was defined by careful budgeting, frequent moves, and a constant awareness that status could evaporate if it wasn't managed properly. Nothing was assumed permanent. Everything had to be accounted for. That mindset never left her. When she married George V and became queen consort, she didn't relax into luxury. She systematized it. The royal household, which had long operated on tradition and habit, suddenly found itself under the quiet command of a woman who wanted documentation. Mary didn't just want to know what the crown owned. She wanted to know where it came from, where it had been, and where it should go next. She turned palaces into archives. Drawers were labeled, cabinets catalogued, jewelry tagged, paintings indexed. Objects that had once floated vaguely through generations of royal use were suddenly assigned identities. Nothing was just a chair. It was the chair from this reign, gifted by this person, used on this occasion. And it was written down, endlessly. Mary kept notebooks filled with lists, dense, meticulous, almost obsessive. Lists of objects, lists of rooms, lists of where items had been seen and where they ought to be returned. She corrected labels written by others. She rewrote inventories she found insufficiently precise. She cross-checked memories against records. If something was misplaced, she noticed. If something went missing, she remembered. This wasn't mere tidiness, it was cognitive order. Biographers who had access to her papers noticed a pattern. Mary seemed calmer when things were documented, when objects were named, when uncertainty was replaced by ink. One historian remarked that she treated the royal collection not as decoration, but as a moral responsibility, as if disorder itself were a threat to monarchy. And in her lifetime, that belief made sense. Mary lived through the collapse of multiple European monarchies. Cousins were exiled, thrones vanished, royal possessions were looted, burned or sold off in revolutions that moved faster than anyone could catalog. To Mary, the lesson was obvious. What isn't recorded doesn't survive. So she recorded everything. Her fixation with order extended beyond objects into procedure. She created filing systems for correspondence. She insisted on proper documentation for gifts. She annotated family histories. She corrected genealogies. She believed that monarchy wasn't just bloodline, it was record-keeping. Without lists, crowns were just hats. The palace tolerated this because it was useful. Her systematization professionalized royal households. It made lending objects to museums possible. It preserved history that might otherwise have vanished. Many items in today's royal collection exist in traceable form because Mary insisted on labeling them a century ago. But usefulness doesn't negate compulsion. Those close to her noticed that Mary became visibly unsettled by ambiguity. Unlabeled objects bothered her. Vague explanations irritated her. When provenance was uncertain, she pursued clarity with relentless determination. She followed paper trails across decades. She wrote letters asking for confirmation of ownership. She kept mental tallies of unresolved details and returned to them again and again. It wasn't about possession this time, it was about certainty. This is where her list-making crosses from diligence into something deeper. Mary did not simply enjoy order, she needed it. In moments of stress, family scandal, abdication crises, wartime disruption, she doubled down on documentation. When Edward VIII abdicated in 1936 and the monarchy faced existential embarrassment, Mary didn't panic publicly. She retreated into systems. Lists, labels, the tangible reassurance that at least something was under control. While the crown shook, the drawers were in order. There's a revealing anecdote from later in her life. During a visit to inspect royal residences, Mary reportedly spent hours checking labels on stored items, correcting handwriting, and ensuring objects were returned to their proper locations. Staff were exhausted. She was energized. This was not busy work. It was regulation of anxiety through structure. Psychologically, this makes sense. Mary's life was one long exercise in containment. She was never queen by right, only by marriage. Her position depended on stability. Her sons' lives were filled with scandal, illness, and abdication. The world she believed in, hierarchy, tradition, continuity, was under constant threat. Lists gave her something solid, something immune to rumor and emotion. A list does not argue, a label does not rebel, a docket does not abdicate, and so she leaned into them. Unlike more flamboyant royal compulsions, Mary's behavior was socially rewarded. She was praised for her organizational skills, for her seriousness, for her devotion to heritage. No one called it obsessive. No one suggested she step back, because order, especially in a monarchy, looks like virtue. But if you strip away the politeness, what you see is a woman who could not relax unless the world was indexed. The most telling detail? Mary did not stop. Even in old age, even when physically frail, she continued to label, list, and correct. Her handwriting grew shakier, but the impulse remained. Objects still needed names. Locations still needed confirmation. History still needed footnotes. When she died in 1953, just months before her granddaughter Elizabeth II's coronation, she left behind not just jewels and furniture, but systems. Organizational frameworks that still shape how royal property is managed today. That is her legacy. Not just a collector, not just a curator, but a monarchical mind that believed survival depended on documentation. If George V collected stamps to regulate emotion, Queen Mary collected order itself. And together, they created a royal household that functioned less like a family and more like an archive. But the irony is hard to miss. All the lists in the world could not prevent the monarchy's future crises. They couldn't stop abdication. They couldn't prevent war. They couldn't guarantee loyalty or stability. They could only create the illusion that everything had a place. And that illusion, carefully labeled, neatly filed, is one the monarchy would cling to again and again. Because when order fails on the outside, royals have a long tradition of recreating it somewhere else, sometimes in lists, sometimes in clocks, and sometimes in gardens so vast and consuming that a king could lose himself in them entirely. Which brings us, carefully, methodically, to George III once more. 21. George III. Scientific improvement, Kew Gardens, and the obsession with cultivation. By the time most monarchs become symbols, their humanity is lost in the footnotes. George III became a symbol in reverse. He started as a man consumed by method, and by the end of his life, he had become a collection of contradictions, at once the image of stability and the embodiment of decline. But buried within the paradox of the mad king and the farmer king is a deeper truth. George III wasn't obsessed with power or wealth or even legacy. He was obsessed with improvement, not improvement in the abstract, utopian sense, but in the soil-bound, spreadsheet-sensible, rational empirical, measure it and fix it kind of way. George III believed the world could be better, not through revolutions or revelations, but through observation, planning, and botanical rigor. His fixation with Kew Gardens, and more broadly with the Enlightenment project of scientific improvement, was not a side interest. It was the gravitational force that pulled his mind into a loop of endless observation, classification, and attempted correction. If his earlier compulsion, meticulously managing agriculture and domestic policy like a high-functioning gentleman farmer, was the first act, then his return to Kew and full scientific immersion was the sequel. And like all sequels, it was darker, more obsessive, and driven by a need to recapture control that had already slipped through his hands. Let's rewind a little. Kew Gardens wasn't originally a royal project. It began as a pleasure garden, expanded under the patronage of Augusta, Princess of Wales, George's mother, and then evolved under George's hand into something far more ambitious. He saw in Kew not a collection of exotic flowers, but an empire of potential. Botany in the 18th century was not a soft science. It was geopolitics with petals. Plants meant medicine, textiles, sugar, tea, rubber, spices, entire industries and economies could be born from a single seed. And George III understood that a crown that could control plants could control the future. What started as a royal garden became a laboratory of empire. George threw himself into this with unrelenting zeal. He promoted botanical exploration, personally supported scientific voyages, and demanded regular reports from botanists across the empire. He corresponded with Joseph Banks, the botanical heavyweight of his day, and transformed Kew into a clearinghouse of imperial flora. To the public, it was charming. To Parliament, it was cost-effective empire building. But to George, it was something more personal, a manifestation of the belief that nothing in nature was beyond improvement. The gardens became his blueprint for governance. Order the specimens, classify the unknown, crossbreed for better results, eradicate pests, enforce structure, and above all, watch everything. It's tempting to romanticize this. After all, Kew today is a marvel of biodiversity and conservation. But in George's hands, it wasn't conservation. It was control. He was less a naturalist and more a natural engineer. Every new plant was a new puzzle. Every failed crop a personal challenge. Every botanical anomaly a data point to be reconciled through deeper study. And when things didn't work, when crops failed, when diseases spread, when certain plants refused to grow, George didn't question the framework. He questioned the inputs. In his view, failure wasn't proof of natural chaos. It was proof that someone hadn't followed the instructions. It was human error. Or worse, insufficient documentation. His obsession didn't stop at flora. George began to apply the same logic of improvement to everything. He micromanaged education systems. He imposed new accounting methods on government departments. He advocated for agricultural reform based on scientific findings. He created model farms. He funded institutions dedicated to the practical arts. He wanted factories to be cleaner, tools to be standardized, and calendars to be more accurate. He was, in every way, a monarch of systems. But systems break down when the inputs refuse to behave. And eventually, George III's own mind became the biggest outlier in his equation. Because what happens when the king who wants to control nature finds his own nature uncontrollable? During the periodic mental health episodes that plagued him, one thing kept surfacing: his obsession with agricultural and scientific data. Witnesses described long rants about crop yields, rambling lectures on animal breeding, recitations of plant names, and impassioned monologues about botanical order. It wasn't the content that disturbed them. It was the intensity, the speed, the inflexibility. The garden, once a symbol of rational leadership, became a metaphor for his spiraling mind. Structured, beautiful, but too carefully tended, too densely planted, too sensitive to change. There's a moment described in historical accounts that seems almost too poetic to be true. George III, during one of his episodes wandering the grounds at Windsor, muttering lists of crops to himself, stopping to inspect shrubs as if trying to remember what season it was, not outside but in his mind. He had tried so hard to engineer order that when the internal disorder came, he simply didn't have the tools to respond. His world wasn't built for unpredictability. And so he fell back into the only thing he trusted: repeatable tasks. Walk the same route, ask the same questions, reorganize the same garden beds, review the same reports, dig a hole, fill it back up, start again. His fixation with scientific improvement, which had once looked like progress, now resembled a loop. Even after he was declared unfit to rule in 1811 and replaced by his son George, later George IV, the elder George continued to live in his botanical bubble. He was blind by then. He had lost hearing. He spoke less and less. But his daily routines persisted. He still asked about gardens. He still requested updates on seeds. He still believed that if he could just get the right combination of soil, water, and patience, something would grow properly again. When he died in 1820, the public image of Farmer George had already been calcified, part propaganda, part affectionate mythology. A stable king, a practical monarch, a man of the people. But the truth was more complex and far more unsettling. George III's obsession with improvement wasn't delusional. It was rational, measured. It came from a real place. The belief that knowledge, discipline, and observation could solve anything. But what he couldn't solve, what no king can solve, is entropy. Things fall apart, minds unravel, gardens overgrow. Sometimes things don't get better no matter how many lists you make or seeds you sow. And for a man who built his identity around steady growth and control, that truth was unbearable. It's why his life is so fascinating and so tragic, because his most famous failures weren't due to neglect, but to overmanagement. He didn't lose America because he didn't care. He lost it because he thought he could out-reason rebellion. He didn't struggle with madness because he ignored his mind. He struggled because he tried to discipline it like a field. But you can't weed your way out of illness, and you can't graft new roots onto a broken inheritance. George III's legacy isn't the loss of the colonies or even the loss of his mind. It's the tension between what can be cultivated and what refuses to grow to plan. And in the next royal we meet, that tension takes on a wildly different shape, not in gardens or lists, but in wheels, reins, and the wide, empty fields of post-war aristocratic boredom. Because after the empire shrank, the traditions cracked, and the horses retired, Prince Philip had to find something else to control. He found carriage driving. 22. Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, carriage driving as post-polo obsession. At first glance, carriage driving sounds innocent enough. Elegant, archaic, vaguely aristocratic. A sport of gloved hands, crisp harnesses, and polished wooden wheels. Something the late 20th century borrowed from the 19th, like tea sets or unspoken emotional repression. But for Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh, carriage driving wasn't a charming hobby. It was a necessity, a structure, a ritual, a replacement. It became, over decades, his post-polo obsession, part sport, part identity repair kit, and entirely shaped by his refusal to sit still. And behind the gloves and reins and gliding carriages, it was also a window into something deeper. Because Prince Philip's compulsion for movement, fast, controlled, competitive, was never just about the horses. It was about reclaiming control in a life built on symbolic dependence. Let's rewind. Philip was never supposed to stand still. Born a prince of Greece and Denmark, exiled before his first memories could set, then raised in borrowed homes across Europe, he spent his early years as a kind of royal refugee. His family had blue blood but no stable base. And when he finally married Princess Elizabeth in 1947, he didn't gain sovereignty. He lost himself to it. He gave up his naval career, gave up his surname, gave up precedence, independence, and, occasionally, his temper. As his wife rose to the throne in 1952, Philip became the world's most prominent +1, a man of action, relegated to ceremony. So he adapted, as he always had. He became a patron, a founder, a speech giver, a ribbon cutter. He shook hands and planted trees, and walked 3 steps behind. But his outlets, his real outlets, were physical, fast-paced, competitive. First, it was polo. Philip played polo like he lived, fast, aggressive, and unrelenting. He trained hard, played harder, and approached the sport not as a pastime but as a personal proving ground. For years, he was known as one of the best royal players in the world. But eventually, age, that quiet assassin of aristocratic masculinity, caught up. The doctor advised him to stop. His joints agreed. The fields stopped calling. And Philip, who was not built to idle, needed something else. Something that scratched the same itch. Enter carriage driving. Most people assumed he picked it up casually. It seemed dignified, traditional, not too risky, royal enough for optics. But what started as a pastime quickly evolved into an all-consuming focus. Philip didn't just participate in carriage driving, he rewrote the sport. He helped codify its rules, designed and modified carriages, commissioned special harnesses and bits, developed training techniques, took his team on competitive circuits across Europe. At 50-something, he was learning whip techniques from scratch. At 70-something, he was still entering high-level competitions. At 80, he was practicing daily. Into his 90s, he was still driving. His carriage driving kit became as essential as his military medals. Horses were chosen with extreme care. Routines were built around training. Household staff were recruited into the logistical network required to keep the entire operation rolling smoothly. It was as much lifestyle as it was sport. But why? Why, in an age of retirement when most royals were reducing their public load, did Philip double down on reins and wheels? Because carriage driving gave him what palace life often denied: control, speed, and a finish line. In royal life, everything is ambiguous. Success is vague. Impact is invisible. Your name is ceremonial. Your schedule is assigned. Your presence is expected, but not explained. There are no races to win, no markers to beat, no satisfaction in getting there first, because there is no there. But in carriage driving, there is. There's a start, a finish, a ranking, a penalty for sloppiness, a reward for grace. And Philip needed that. He needed consequences. He needed goals. He needed something physical, measurable, real. Observers noted how meticulous he became, how intensely focused. His grooms and trainers often spoke about his dedication, his refusal to compromise, his eye for detail. He didn't just drive. He studied the terrain. He diagrammed routes. He analyzed wheel balance. He adjusted every inch of his rig until it worked his way. It wasn't just a sport, it was a survival system. In a world where everything about him was ceremonial, carriage driving was literal. Move the horses wrong and the carriage tips. Misjudge a turn and you hit a gate. Fail to prepare and you lose. The stakes, though sporting, were real enough to matter. And they insulated him from the dull grind of duty. Because for all his public appearances, Prince Philip was not sentimental about monarchy. He respected it, upheld it, even modernized parts of it. But he didn't need it to feel fulfilled. In fact, he often appeared most himself when he was not wearing a crown, but a helmet. Carriage driving became his escape from palace inertia. A world of leather straps, speed limits, and deliberate turns. A sport that required both brute strength and subtlety. It also filled a social gap. The carriage driving world wasn't just royal adjacent. It was filled with farmers, gentry, equestrian diehards. People who didn't curtsy, but competed. In that space, Philip could just be a man with a stopwatch and a stubborn streak. He thrived in it. By his later years, his name was inseparable from the sport. He introduced it to new generations, helped make it popular beyond Britain, even developed competitions for younger drivers. He spoke about it with the same seriousness most people reserved for geopolitical strategy. It wasn't a footnote, it was a chapter. When he was finally forced to give it up, not by choice but by age, he did it reluctantly. After his retirement from public life in 2017 and even after his crash in 2019, when he was 97 and still driving solo, he resisted fully stopping. Eventually, he ceded to the practicalities. But the routines remained. The horses, the harnesses, the endless adjustments. Because in the end, Prince Philip wasn't addicted to the sport. He was addicted to what the sport gave him: agency. And in the monarchy, where so much is fixed, ritualized, and ornamental, agency is a rare luxury. The irony is that, to the public, this compulsion barely registered. Most saw it as an old man's charming country pastime. But like so many royal fixations, it was carefully managed, publicly softened, and privately all-consuming. Philip's life was a long negotiation between structure and independence, between service and self-definition. Carriage driving offered him a kingdom he could control at speed, with reins in hand and no need to wait for the next ceremonial cue. It didn't give him power, it gave him momentum, and the monarchy, for all its tradition, often depends on that illusion that its members are moving forward even when standing still. Which brings us to another king who tried to preserve momentum by collecting motionless things, stamps. Because where Philip chased roads, George V chased adhesives. Obsessively, quietly, with a kingly sense of urgency, and a stamp album thick enough to smother the weight of empire. 23. George V. Stamp collecting as obsession and emotional regulation. George V didn't speak in outbursts. He didn't rule by charisma or seduce by spectacle. He was not a flamboyant monarch or a master of performance. Instead, he mumbled, grumbled, smoked constantly, preferred the company of birds, dogs, and stamps to that of his own courtiers. If he had a superpower, it was endurance, not charm. So when you read that George V was one of the most prolific stamp collectors in royal or global history, you might shrug. It seems harmless, quirky even. The Collector King, they called him, as if that title softened the weight of the one he actually held. But stamp collecting for George wasn't a quiet pastime. It wasn't just a hobby. It was an obsession with control, disguised as gentility. He started collecting in childhood, inheriting a modest album from his father, Edward VII. That seedling collection, which might have amounted to a few hundred stamps, eventually evolved into what became known as the Royal Philatelic Collection, a cultural treasure housing hundreds of thousands of rare and meticulously preserved stamps, many of them personally acquired, inspected, and sometimes even mounted by George himself. Let's be clear, this was not a symbolic endeavor. George wasn't signing off on stamp-related decisions from a distance. He was deeply involved, studying, corresponding with dealers, attending exhibitions, and even writing notes in the margins of his collection pages. He read specialist catalogs, corrected errors in philatelic publications, and cross-referenced issues with the precision of a scientific archivist. Stamp collecting, to George V, was more than aesthetic. It was narrative control in microform. Each stamp told a story, issued at a specific time, for a specific reason, often tied to empire, monarchy, or national celebration. A stamp was a tiny, adhesive certificate of power, and he had thousands. There's a moment from his reign that illustrates this perfectly. In 1913, the British Postal Service issued the Seahorse's stamps, lavishly engraved, high-value definitives. George wasn't just pleased, he was elated. He is said to have spent hours reviewing the different printings, comparing ink shades, evaluating alignment, margin spacing. To any outsider, it would seem compulsive. But for George, it was grounding. This was the world reduced to order. Ink on paper, a perfect miniature. And yet, no matter how vast his collection became, it never quite looked like a trophy case. It looked like a bunker. Because that's what it was. Behind the formal suits and gruff mustache, George V was not an especially confident ruler. He inherited a throne during a time of upheaval, constitutional crises, suffrage battles, global war, the collapse of cousin monarchies across Europe. His Russian relatives were executed, his German cousins dethroned. The idea of monarchy itself was cracking under modernity's weight, and so George did the one thing he knew how to do. He cataloged. He built an empire of stamps while the physical empire started to fracture. You could almost measure the tension of his reign and how his collecting habits intensified. During World War I, while sons were at the front and public support for the monarchy wavered, George kept to his daily routines. He walked the gardens, smoked, and when possible, he worked on his stamps. Reports say that he could spend hours in total silence, bent over an album, tweezers in hand, eyes scanning for misprints or rare watermarks. This was his sanctuary. Not a throne room, but a table with glue and magnifiers. Where the rules didn't change. Where countries had fixed borders, exact names, and clear dates. Unlike real politics. There was even a peculiar moment when George V allegedly paid £1,450, an enormous sum at the time, for a single 2-pence Mauritius stamp. When his staff raised eyebrows, he reportedly said, "I wish to have the best stamp collection in the world, and I don't care what it costs." That wasn't vanity. It was preservation. Preservation of the monarchy, yes, but also of self, of continuity, of emotional regulation in an era where everything else was unpredictable. And perhaps it's no coincidence that the Royal Philatelic Collection became the most complete record of British postal history in existence, far more than any official government archive. Because George trusted his own filing system more than the empire's. But collecting has its edge. Because when does collection become compulsion? When does preservation become hoarding? And when does a king start retreating into his collection, not to celebrate reality, but to avoid it? This is where George V's obsession gets quietly tragic. His stamp albums were always within reach. His schedule always included time for the collection. His letters always included mentions of acquisitions. Even as monarchical roles modernized and his own children clashed with him, especially the flamboyant David, later Edward VIII, George's attention remained fixed on a world of page protectors and precise classifications. And he wasn't alone. Multiple staff members, some royal, some postal, were tasked with maintaining and expanding the collection under his oversight. Meetings were held, transactions logged, archiving protocols enforced. This wasn't a hobby. It was a shadow administration, one that offered a version of Britain that was manageable. Because stamps don't revolt. They don't gossip. They don't change their minds. They don't question your rule or elope with Americans. They just sit quietly in albums, waiting to be observed, admired, and controlled. It's hard not to see George's obsession as a kind of feedback loop. The more unstable the world became, the more he retreated into the ordered empire of adhesive proofs. And the more he clung to that order, the less able he became to connect emotionally with the world outside. His children noticed. Elizabeth, later the Queen Mother, found him cold. David, Edward VIII, found him stifling. Even his beloved son Bertie, George VI, struggled with the pressure of his father's exacting standards. Because George didn't tolerate disorder. He filed everything, including feelings, into the neat, silent categories of what could be managed. And when he died in 1936, the Royal Philatelic Collection was considered not just a national treasure, but a psychological map. Because kings write history with swords. But George V tried to write his with tiny portraits, printed in ink, pressed into a silence he could finally understand. The collection still exists, still growing, still meticulously curated, still defined by the rules he helped shape. But its most telling stamp is not the rarest. It's the most common one. The one he returned to again and again. The 1 penny red. Ubiquitous, plain, consistent, reissued over and over. Because sometimes when the world changes too fast, it's not the rare things we cling to. It's the familiar ones. And while George kept his monarchy bound in albums, the next royal we returned to did something slightly more scandalous. Not a collector, not a tweaker, but a gambler. And not just of money, but of reputation. Because Edward VII didn't just love the game. He brought it all the way to courtroom testimony. 24. Edward VII. Gambling and the reputational fallout of the Tranby Croft affair. By the time Albert Edward ascended the throne in 1901 and became Edward VII, he was already famous. Not for his speeches or his statesmanship, but for his lifestyle. The man was, to put it delicately, a collector of indulgences. He had taste, charm, wardrobe flair, a carnivorous appetite for pleasure, and crucially, an incurable weakness for risk. Which makes the fact that he nearly dragged the monarchy into full-blown scandal over a game of cards feel almost poetic. Because Edward VII wasn't just a gambler in the metaphorical sense. He literally gambled, frequently, recklessly, and once, very publicly. Let's set the scene. It's 1890. Queen Victoria is still on the throne, deep into her mourning, and her eldest son, already 60-ish, silver-whiskered, and seasoned in the art of aristocratic leisure, is the Prince of Wales. He holds no formal political power, but he holds enormous cultural weight, and everything he does is interpreted as a model for the upper classes. And what he's doing regularly is playing baccarat, which seems harmless enough until you remember that baccarat was illegal in Britain at the time when played for money, not just frowned upon in polite society, actually against the law. That didn't stop Edward, of course. He believed in decorum, not restriction. He wasn't about to be told he couldn't sit at a green felt table with a cigar, a scotch, and a stack of chips. His logic: what's the point of being royal if not to slightly edit the rules? Enter Tranby Croft, a country house in Yorkshire, home of Arthur Wilson, a wealthy shipping magnate trying to ingratiate himself with high society. The prince was invited for a weekend of hunting, socializing, and crucially, cards. Among the guests was one Lieutenant Colonel Sir William Gordon Cumming, a well-known guards officer and bachelor. The party was lively, the drinks free-flowing, the baccarat table ever busy. Then came the whisper. Some guests, discreetly, began to suspect that Gordon Cumming was cheating. More specifically, that he was adding chips after the hand had been played. A cardinal sin, even in an illegal game. 5 witnesses, 4 women and 1 man, claimed they saw him do it. No one made a scene, but the implication was explosive. Here's where it gets royal. Rather than reporting the incident or letting Gordon Cumming defend himself publicly, the guests handled it in-house. They confronted him. He denied it. Edward, now in the most delicate position possible, was pulled into the private arbitration. The prince asked Gordon Cumming to sign a document pledging never to play baccarat again. In exchange, the affair would be kept quiet. And he agreed. That could have been the end of it. But it wasn't. A few months later, rumors leaked. They spread like smoke through London clubs and drawing rooms. Gordon Cumming's reputation was collapsing. In response, he made the boldest move of his life. He sued the 5 accusers for slander. And here's the problem. The only way to resolve the lawsuit was to have a full trial, in court, in public, under oath. Which meant Prince Edward, heir to the throne, moral example of the realm, would be forced to take the stand and testify about an illegal gambling party that he not only attended but facilitated. It was a PR catastrophe before PR was even a field. For the first time in British history, a future monarch was dragged into a civil courtroom, not as a plaintiff or sovereign, but as a witness to his own embarrassment. The trial lasted 6 days. Edward, to his credit, was calm and composed. He admitted he knew baccarat was illegal, admitted he had played it often. He claimed he hadn't seen any cheating, but the damage wasn't in the verdict, it was in the spectacle. The court eventually ruled against Gordon Cumming, but the real loser was the image of royal untouchability. The affair made headlines across the empire. Satirists had a field day. Parliament squirmed. Victoria was livid. The idea that the Prince of Wales was hobnobbing with accused cheats, hosting illegal games, and asking people to sign silence pacts? Not ideal. And that's just the part the public saw. Behind closed doors, it was worse. This wasn't a one-off for Edward. His gambling had long been known in elite circles. Private clubs tolerated it. Foreign courts expected it. But what the Tranby Croft affair exposed was how dependent he was on the entire machinery of secrecy. The club code, the unspoken agreements, the understanding that certain behaviors, so long as they stayed contained, could be overlooked. When that code broke, even just a little, the entire illusion wobbled, and the palace scrambled to patch it up. The court minimized it. Biographers softened it. Later historians reframed it as a social faux pas. But at its core, This wasn't about one game. It was about a royal compulsion to play, not just with cards but with consequences. Edward believed he could outcharm scandal. He had done it for decades. Extramarital affairs, lavish spending, constant travel, endless distractions. The man turned leisure into a constitutional art form, and yet it was always on the edge of disaster. One leak, one lawsuit, one misplaced card away from collapse. Because at the heart of it all was a man who needed the game. He needed stakes. He needed to win. Not just at cards, but at perception, at social power, at the balancing act of being both the people's prince and the aristocracy's debonair rogue. And after the Tranbycroft fallout, Edward didn't stop gambling. He just did it more carefully. The palace tightened. The press played nicer. The handlers got better at misdirection. The monarchy learned a lesson. When the heir insists on playing with risk, you better control the lighting. Which raises the question, what do you do with a king who can't stop? Courting scandal? You crown him, apparently, because when Queen Victoria died in 1901, Edward finally became king. And surprisingly, he ruled with competence and restraint. The gambler became a diplomat. The playboy became a patron. The man who once risked the monarchy in a card game became its unifying figure. But the core didn't change. The thrill-seeking, the appetite, the constant movement, it just wore better clothes. His life remained, in many ways, a performance of moderation masking compulsion. The court's job was no longer to hide it, but to frame it as charm. And that's the royal trick, isn't it? Some obsessions get labeled as eccentric. Others get passed off as hobbies. Some, like Edward's, become mythologized into stories of rakish glamour. But they all share a root, a craving for something the crown alone can't satisfy. Which leads us to another kind of compulsion altogether. Not the thrill of the gamble, but the daily ritual of grief. 25. George IV. Medical sedation as managed incapacity. George IV, by the end of his life, wasn't so much reigning as he was being propped up, with cushions, with excuses, and, increasingly, with laudanum. Not that anyone said it outright. Royal communications didn't come with medical footnotes. Courtiers didn't circulate bulletins titled Our Majesty's Morphine Habit. And the press, in the age before flashbulbs and leaks, played along, out of fear, loyalty, or simply habit. But behind the layers of velvet and gilt, beneath the wigs and diplomatic platitudes, was a man who had become a sedated sovereign. Managed, dosed, and distanced from the functions of state by a chemical relationship he never publicly acknowledged but very much depended on. This was George IV in his final decade, a king who ruled through protocol but lived through painkillers. Let's rewind. George IV, formerly the flamboyant Prince Regent, had always been the monarchy's greatest contradiction. A man obsessed with appearance, ceremony, and elegance, yet plagued by insecurity, illness, and self-inflicted instability. His youth had been a fireworks display of excess, gambling, mistresses, fashion, architecture, debts. No one did splendor like George, but splendor, as ever, comes with invoices. And by his 50s, the bills were physiological. Years of overindulgence had wrecked his health. Gout, dropsy, obesity, anxiety, gastric problems, chronic pain. Even his famously elaborate wardrobe, tight jackets, restrictive collars, polished shoes, became a tormenting armor. He was no longer performing majesty. He was enduring it. That's where laudanum entered the chat. For those unfamiliar, laudanum is a potent tincture of opium, often mixed with alcohol. In the 18th and 19th centuries, it was medicine, magic, and mystery all at once. Prescribed liberally for everything from headaches to heartbreak, it was both respected and misused. And it was everywhere. George IV didn't invent royal opiate use, but he might have turned it into an administrative model. Records from the royal household and later medical accounts paint a portrait of a monarch deeply reliant on chemical sedation. Palace staff noted the quantities. Medical advisors at times grew concerned. He wasn't just treating pain, he was numbing life itself. At court, it was managed discreetly. His physicians had authority, but not transparency. Doses were adjusted behind closed doors. Public appearances were shortened. Delays were explained away as fatigue. And slowly, governance was reshaped around a king who increasingly couldn't, or wouldn't, be fully present. Because sedation, unlike scandal, is quiet. It doesn't leak. It doesn't cheat. It doesn't throw lavish parties. It simply dims the room, gently. This was the version of George IV that presided over the final years of his reign. A man whose once lavish tastes had shrunk into the confines of a padded room and a locked medicine cabinet. He still signed papers, still received ministers, but increasingly he was governed by dosage. Contemporaries noticed the difference. One observer wrote that George had gone from gilded peacock to mechanical shadow, a monarch whose eyes sparkled less from wit and more from morphine haze. He grew irritable, unpredictable, withdrawn. His letters, once bombastic, became short, defensive. His weight ballooned, his public outings dwindled. Yet the monarchy carried on. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. The institution didn't need him awake. It needed him intact, symbolic. A body in the right chair with the right signature, wearing the right crown. Functional monarchy by this point could run on sedated autopilot. And so it did. Behind the scenes, ministers took more control. Protocols tightened. Speeches were read for him. Illness was whispered about but never confirmed. His dependencies were treated not as vices, but as therapeutic necessities. Because to admit otherwise would raise a terrifying question. What happens when the king is no longer cognitively sovereign? In George IV's case, the answer was silence. Controlled silence. Historians still debate the extent of his dependence. Addiction, as a medical term, didn't exist in the way we use it today. But what is indisputable is the pattern. Increased use, decreased visibility, and a palace machine designed to keep up appearances. And what a strange inversion it is. A man once defined by too much presence, too many parties, debts, headlines, became a man defined by strategic absence, not abdicated, not incapacitated, just muted. It was a kind of velvet sedation, painless, polite, and very royal, and the image was preserved. After his death in 1830, George IV was mourned as a complicated figure, flawed, flamboyant, but never forgettable. Public narratives emphasized his taste, his style, his architectural legacy, see Brighton Pavilion, and his contributions to royal ceremony. Few dwelled on the morphine. Fewer still asked how long the country had been run without him. Because to raise that question risks exposing the fragility of the entire system. That monarchy, for all its pageantry, is still built on human thresholds. And when the threshold is exceeded by grief, addiction, or sedation, the solution isn't reform, it's management. George IV didn't overdose the throne. He outlasted it in slow chemical increments. A crown dulled by medical necessity. A reign that became a ritual. A man who slipped, one drop at a time, into royal silence. Which leaves us with an irony, quietly devastating. In youth, George IV feared obscurity. He wanted to be remembered, loved, admired, envied. He built monuments to himself, designed uniforms, published portraits. Every room he entered was rearranged around his presence. But in death, the thing people most remember is how he became invisible. He didn't vanish like an exile or explode in scandal. He faded. With dignity, with privacy, and with a little too much laudanum. And yet, he wasn't the only royal to manage pain through ritual, habit, or compulsion. Because just beyond his reign, the royal family would encounter yet another scandal in waiting. Not a king this time, but a prince. Charming, well-connected, in love with adventure, and whispered about endlessly. And as rumors swirled, the palace scrambled once again to contain a far more dangerous implication, that one of their own may have been addicted to more than just power.